Welcome to the Dixie Cryptid YouTube channel. 25 stories in this video. I don't know how long it's going to be, but the first story you hear will be the prelude to a brand new audio book that was just released by Jack LaFountain. I got to narrate the book. The title of the book is Death Haunts the Red River. It's a sequel to Death Rides the Red River that we did about a year and a half ago. It just came out on Audible. There'll be a link in the description if you'd like to go buy it. I hope you do. If you'd like a promo code for a free book, if you'll send an email to dixiecryptid@gmail.com and in the subject line write book code, the first 25 I get, I'll send you back a book code. I probably won't check it for about a day or two, but when I check it, I'll send you a code and you can download a free copy of Death Haunts the Red River. Thanks, Jack, for letting me narrate this one. All right, that's enough said. 25 stories. Hope you guys enjoy this. All right, here we go. Prologue. Jess couldn't sleep. Trying to get comfortable, he turned over for what seemed like the 100th time in the last hour. It was no good, and it was all his fault. "Are you awake?" he asked, shaking his wife by the shoulder. "Yes, now hush," his wife replied, turning away from him. "You're not asleep." "Yes, I am. I'm dreaming. My rude husband is bothering me." "Well, I'm not asleep." "Well, good. You deserve to be awake after the way you acted tonight. You were just downright cruel." "I've got to go to the outhouse." "Well, don't wake me up when you get back." Jess threw back the covers and pulled his boots on and started for the door. His stomach was doing even more tossing and turning than the rest of him. He laid a hand over his rumbling middle when the message changed from upset to urgency. He bolted from the back door. He had covered half the distance to the outhouse when it stepped out from behind the little building. It looked almost human until it dropped to all fours with a menacing growl. His bowel and bladder let go, and he gave his soiling no thought as he wheeled around and sprinted for the back door in a blind panic with a wild scream. He sensed more than heard the monster coming. Against all odds, he bounded up a step and opened the door and slammed it behind him. Frozen in fear, he braced himself against the barrier between him and the snarling horror outside. The assault he expected didn't follow. "Jess, what's the matter?" his wife demanded from the door to their room. She lifted the candle in her hand higher, and the terror on his face and the condition of his drawers turned her tone from anger to sympathy. "Oh, Jess, it's all right. Let's get you cleaned up." Able to move once more, he ran past her, making only a gagging sound. He pulled the shotgun down from above the mantel, and checked the load and snapped it closed again. "Get behind me," he told her, bringing the weapon to bear on the back door as she did so. Her scream unnerved him. He pulled the trigger. Double-aught buckshot tore a hole in the door. But the trembling hand of his wife pointed to the real danger. A hair-covered hand with claws shattered the window to his left and ripped the remaining shards away. Jess, shotgun leading the way, charged at the monstrous figure clawing its way inside. Before he could fire, it dropped from sight. He stuck the barrel through the window and his head followed into the moonlight. His wife screamed as claws dug into his neck and he disappeared. The sound of his tortured cries and ripping flesh and snapping bones sickened her. It wasn't until the sounds abruptly stopped, replaced by silence from outside, that she vomited. As she was retching, the wolf leaped through the window, rose onto two legs, and slowly advanced on her. She scrambled to the safety of her bedroom and fell behind her bed screaming for help. The door she had closed was ripped away. "God help me." Here's an email from Lionel. Here's what he writes. "I just ran across your YouTube page and I found the Mississippi stories to be interesting. I wanted to briefly offer some of my experiences in the woods of my home state. One of my encounters occurred on my family's property 20 years ago, 15 miles east of Greenwood, Mississippi, during bow season. I had a nice food plot set up in the woods about a half mile from the nearest house. These small plots gave the deer something to eat and an easy escape route to the trees. It made them comfortable. I had a lock-on stand set up on the edge of the field. The Primos company had a new hunting call with a fawn bleat sound. I thought it might help draw a doe in, and I hit the fawn bleat a few times and I waited. 15 minutes later, I see what I think is a large Labrador retriever enter the opposite end of my food plot heading towards me. As it approached, I quickly realized that it wasn't a dog. It was a black panther. The paws were massive. I was amazed and scared at the same time. I was already in a standing position with an arrow nocked. It approached my stand, so I drew back when it got close to the base of my tree. When I drew, it looked up at me, but it never stopped moving as it passed my position. I decided not to shoot because I thought that I stood a better chance of getting out of there alive by leaving him be, rather than potentially wounding a deadly predator. I also recall that my grandfather had told my uncles that the big cats were there many years ago. Looking from above him, his shoulder width was only about a foot wide, but from the top of his back to the bottom of his belly was massive, 3 feet or so. From head to tail, he was about 7 feet long. That's body length, approximately 5 feet. He showed no fear of me and almost acted like he knew me in a funny way. I'd hunted there in those woods since I was a young teen. I stayed in the stand until it was dark, and then I got down. I thought that would be the best for me to follow the panther's route a ways to ensure that he was gone. So I walked about 50 yards into the wooded trail that I saw him follow. In the glow of my flashlight, I saw green eye shine, and then his head extended out from behind an oak tree. I stopped, and I nocked an arrow, and I began stepping backwards until I made it up to the open field that was on top of the hill. I put my arrow back in the quiver, and I ran a half a mile to my truck. The area where this happened is Coahuila, Mississippi. In the Native American language, it means the panther lives here. They were definitely correct about that. My second odd experience was on another hunting location in South Mississippi, located west of Hazelhurst, Mississippi. I took a day off during the week to do some turkey hunting. I got a late start, but I had a good idea of where I needed to go for a late morning hunt. The land is 140 acres my family owns, and it's miles from the nearest town. After a mile walk, I set my turkey decoys up in an opening that had 2 trails running perpendicular to my position. I sat in the corner. I sat against a large oak tree and chilled for a few. To see if anything would sound off, I tried an owl call. Immediately, an owl called back just a short distance in front of me, and then another to my left. The responding calls were too loud and from 2 separate animals. This was not an owl. It was something mimicking an owl, and it was something with big lungs. I packed my gear and I headed for the truck. This hunt was over. The next winter, I took my son and uncle in there for a quick squirrel hunt. My son was little, but I wanted to get him exposed to the woods. We started hearing trees being pushed over in the distance. I asked my uncle what he thought it was, and he didn't have a clue. And then we got the hell out of there again. This hunt was over too. I did some research after those events, and I learned that others had posted sightings of Bigfoot creatures on the BFRO page. I never saw the creature, but I'm certain that something is there. And these are my experiences in Mississippi. Thank you for offering a platform to discuss these things. Lionel, that big cat story, that is I got to be honest with you. I've got friends that say that. I've heard them say it for years, and I always think they're full of crap. I even tell them that they are. They ain't no big cats in here. They ain't, especially no black cats. But now I'm starting to see pictures on the internet from my friends. They're emailing them to me, and they're posting them on Facebook and Instagram of these actual big black cats they're getting on their game cams. One guy even took a picture of one from his truck. It was just walking along the road, and he took a picture of it next to his truck. And all of the wildlife agencies, especially the TWRA, they'll deny that those black cats are in there, or even any kind of mountain lion. But I'm starting to think that it's for real, man. And these guys that are sending me pictures, they're not looking for attention. They're not crackpots. I'll just say it. They're not making stuff up. These are serious guys. They're serious hunters. Some of them are people who used to tell the people that had experiences with these cats that they're full of bull. I mean, they didn't believe either until they saw one. Now, here's the thing. Where are these cats coming from? I don't know. I honestly don't think they're natural in this era of history to this area. I think they were all killed out, 100 or 200 years ago. I think they are exotic pets that have escaped and gone wild again. And you never see two together. At least, I haven't heard of any. But anyway, I'm just rambling on, talking about nothing, but it's interesting. And then you've got two possible Bigfoot encounters with noises with the owls and the trees being pushed over. I mean, nothing but a bulldozer's going to push a tree over other than a Bigfoot. So I would say you probably got some stuff going on down there, Lionel. All right, man, thanks for sending the story. You did an awesome job writing it. I didn't have to change hardly anything at all. It's perfect, buddy. Thanks very much. Here's an email from Wayne, and this is crazy. My name is Wayne, and this is about an encounter with a Bigfoot. My father and I were on a hunting trip in the foothills of North Carolina. We had set out corn to bait deer in the area the week before. We decided to camp out in the area and go hunting the following morning. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I was awoken by the sound of some rustling around of some leaves and the snapping of twigs on the ground. I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside to see what it was. 50 feet away, I saw something that at first looked like a bear eating a deer. The deer was still moving, or twitching as if it had just been killed. Within a second, a horrible odor hit me, smelling like something in decay or rotting. It was terrible. It must have heard me move because it quickly stood up on 2 feet. It wasn't a bear, and I realized what I was seeing. I fell back into the tent and lifted my rifle in the direction of the beast. Then I heard heavy footfalls of this thing charging the tent. And within a second, we were both lifted into the air like we were in a sack. The Bigfoot had picked the tent up and was dragging us along the ground. I worked the rifle around and got off a few shots. This made the creature release its grip on the tent, and we fell to the ground. Through the holes I shot through the tent fabric, I saw a blinding white light for just a second, and then everything went deathly quiet. My father breathing was all I could hear. My father asked in a panicked state what was going on, but it took me a while to compose myself to tell him what had happened. We both got out of the tent with our firearms, but the creature was gone. The only thing that remained was the mutilated deer. We packed our gear and we left at daylight. And on our way out, thinking the event was over, we saw a line of black SUVs parked along the road. A couple of men stepped out and waved us down, and we stopped. They came to the window and asked several questions about why we were there, and then they asked if we had seen anything unusual while camping. Well, I've heard and read about these things, and I kept my mouth shut. I told the man we hadn't seen anything. Apparently, he believed my lie, and we drove home. I've never shared this story with the public, but I think it's now is the right time, seeing more and more people are coming forward and deciding to share their experiences. Well, that's a short, compact, scary, terrifying story. Holy crap. I mean, he sees a Bigfoot, it comes over, picks the tent up, dragging. Where's it taking you? Where was it dragging you to in the tent? And then you got off a couple of shots. Thank God you had a firearm. It lets you go. And then there's this white light, which brings in what? I don't know. I don't know what that means. But it leads me to believe like this thing was, I don't know, interdimensional. Whoop. This bright light happens and it disappears. Man, what a scary story. I really appreciate you sending it, Wayne. That's a good one. That's a real good one. Thank you, man. This is a good story. The writer wants to keep his name out of it. Here's what he writes. On a Friday in August in 1976, school was about to start. I was helping some friends of my parents do some yard work. They had recently bought the house and there was a lot of work to do. My father must have told them that I needed some work, so they asked if I would help do the job. I didn't know them, but I was willing to do whatever to make some spending cash. At that time, I was 17 years old. School was about to start, and some cash in my pocket was always needed. That morning, I rode my motorcycle to their house, and at the end of the day, storms began to gather. I stayed put waiting for the rain to stop, and I got to know the couple a little better. The house sat on 50 acres with woods and bean fields on 3 sides of this property. At the corner of the property, the owners had planted a field for wildlife, a food plot. While we waited for the rain to stop, we sat on their back porch and watched the deer through field glasses. The rain had the deer moving. The owners went inside to clean up, and I stayed on the porch and watched the field. When I looked through the binoculars again, the deer were gone, and I saw 3 huge brown figures in the food plot. They were 300 yards from me, and there was no way to make out the details. However, from what I could make out, they appeared to be walking on 2 legs. The binoculars came away from my face and then back again and again. I was trying to clear my eyes and make sure that I was seeing what I was seeing. What was I seeing? A few minutes later, the man walked out asking how many deer I could see, and I immediately asked him if cattle were being put out anywhere around his property. He said he didn't know of any. Matter of fact, he knew no one in the area raised cattle. Raising the field glasses to my eyes again, the animals were gone. I only saw the green of the field. It was still raining, but it looked as if it would stop soon and I could be on my way. But I kept surveying the field. This whole thing was really strange. If I held the binoculars really still and if I concentrated on one spot, I could just make out the shape of a large upright creature inside the woods. The image I saw was an upright human-like creature standing on 2 legs. Only the shape. There were no details. They were tucked into the shadows of the trees. And to the side, I caught some more movement, and I shifted the field glasses to see another one. And then I shifted my gaze back to the first, only to have lost it. This went on for 30 minutes or an hour. These things looked like the Bigfoot images that I had seen in books and on television, just like a Bigfoot. The rain finally stopped and it was getting dark, but I kept looking through those glasses. I'm sure the couple wondered what I was doing. Eventually they came outside and asked if everything was okay, and I told them it was. I laid the binoculars on the table. I then blurted out, "Do you mind if I walk down to your food plot and look around?" "Well, don't you need to get home?" they asked. "Yes, sir, but I think I saw a big buck down there and I want to see if I can find his tracks." I was lying. "Sure, go ahead. We're leaving to go meet some friends for dinner. You let yourself out." And then they left. I turned and walked to the field. It was a long way. I had to see this. When I was close to the trees, I immediately heard something walking in the leaves just inside the trees. I could hear branches breaking and leaves shuffling. What do I do now? Should I go further? Something big was definitely in there. I admit it shook me up. so I backed away and I made it back to the house and I drove home. But before I left the area, I found several perfect tracks of huge bare feet in that new mud. That morning, the field had been dust. Now it was soft, slippery mud. I knew those tracks had just been made. I got home and I wanted to say something to my father that night, but what was I going to say? I made it home, I got cleaned up, and I went out with some friends. Those images were on my mind all night. I was distracted while I was with my friends, and one of my buddies asked me what was on my mind. I actually broke down and told him the story. He was blown away. "We have to go see what this was," he said, and suddenly I was excited. I wasn't going in there alone, but I would go if someone else went with me, and the plans were made. I would pick him up at 6 a.m. and we would go check it out. The next morning at 6:30 a.m. we were parked on the other side of this stretch of woods, opposite to the house that I had worked on the day before. We found a graveled area to park at, and in the low light of the morning we walked into those woods. Within 20 or 30 paces, we knew we were being watched and tracked. Footsteps in the leaves were clearly audible. This made us both nervous, but we kept walking. My plan was to walk straight through this patch of woods to the field where the food plot was. Something was tracking us all the way there. We never saw anything, but we knew something was there with us with every step. We were approaching the edge of the field, and light was shining into the woods from the east. There were these strange, uniform openings in the leaves of the trees about 8 foot or 9 feet off the ground. Perfectly round spaces that were illuminated by the light coming through. We looked at them closer and I could see woven branches into almost perfect 18-inch circles at about 8 feet off the ground, and the leaves and green branches of the trees had been woven into them. They made a sort of porthole through the canopy. I think these were observation holes so that the creatures could watch the field and remain concealed. It was amazing. In the field, we saw several tracks in the mud and grass. Perfect impressions of huge bare feet that looked human, but they were 3 times as big as a human's foot. I could not believe what I was seeing. We eased down the tree line, and we were followed the whole way. Crunch, snap, crunch of the leaves mimicked every step we took. I asked my buddy what he thought about going back through the woods to our car. He shrugged and said, "Well, let's go." So back into the forest we went. I don't know what we were thinking. Maybe it was youthful curiosity, or maybe we were just stupid. But I will admit that I'm still a bit that way. Curiosity usually wins over fear with me. Taking a different route back, we saw a lot of tree and branch manipulation. Tree limbs snapped off and hanging, still attached to the trees with fibers or bark. Some were 3 to 4 inch trunks bent over or snapped off and laid in deliberate locations, and they seemed to form a path. I could see it as I lined them up with my eye, and we followed the tree breaks. What happened next is something that I have never heard of regarding Bigfoot. Now, I'm not a student of the creature by any means, just a casual interest due to this encounter. But in the few encounters that I've heard or read, never once has anyone said that they found a Bigfoot bathroom or an outhouse, but that is exactly what we walked into. In a small opening in the midst of that forest was an area so covered in poop that it looked as if it had been dumped from a truck and then scattered about. Poop was in piles. Poop was splattered on tree trunks and all over the vegetation in this area. Perfect tracks were everywhere. Some of the tracks were in the piles of scat. There was one low, thick limb jutting from an oak tree that was only 5 or 6 feet from the ground. Under this branch was a big pile of poop. They had been sitting on this branch like a human would use a toilet. We could hardly catch our breath over the smell of feces and stale urine. Flies swarmed the area in a frenzy. There would be no way for you to imagine how much poop we saw under that tree limb. I could elaborate, but I won't. My only conclusion is that these things have a very active digestive system. Man, it was bad. I had to get out of there, and we kept moving. Finally, away from the buzzing of insects around this Bigfoot sewage dump, we could hear our stalkers again, keeping step with us in the woods, never seeing anything but always knowing they were there. Maybe we were heading in the wrong direction, or towards an area that they did not want us, but whatever the reason, these creatures started screaming at us. It seemed as if the woods were full of these things, and roars and screeches came from a long distance away. The creatures that were nearer to us and surrounded us made lower, less ominous noises, mainly grunts and growls, but the farther we walked, the more agitated they seemed. It was time to go. I knew where we were in relation to our car, but I didn't know how far. I turned us in the direction of safety, and we picked up the pace. I think we walked close to the turd yard again because the smell was getting stronger, and then it finally let up. Thank God we didn't have to walk back through there again. We picked up our pace to a jog and had traveled for about 5 or 10 minutes. When 20 feet in front of me, I saw a dark figure slither through the leaves while almost flat to the ground. It circled around to my right, and it shot back between us, behind me and in front of my buddy. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. My buddy didn't see it until it was 10 feet directly in front of him and moving from his right to his left. I won't repeat what he said, but let me assure you that he was quite startled. We stopped dead in our tracks and we watched this thing slither or belly crawl to a tree, and then it stood upright behind a large tree trunk. And then it poked its head from around the trunk and it looked right at us. It was only 3 or 4 feet tall, small compared to the image I had in my mind as it plowed through the leaves, moving between us. I assumed this was a toddler, and I knew if we were to seem like a threat to this young one, we were in big trouble. Mama had to be close by. I looked back at my partner behind me only to see him pick up a stick and throw it at this thing. While I remained completely silent and calm, in my mind I was screaming, "What in the hell is he doing?" He later explained that he wanted to see it run. What an idiot. "Let's go," I said, and he and I started running in the line that we had previously set to the truck. 10 to 15 steps into our run, right in front of us an adult Bigfoot stood in our way. Mama had been watching us with her baby. Apparently, it had been there the whole time, and we had been distracted by the baby Bigfoot, or it had moved in front of us while the idiot was throwing sticks at its child. I stopped cold in my tracks, and 10 feet away, a giant stood there heaving and watching me. I looked right at its face and into those black eyes for several seconds. This probably sounds strange, but the thought entered my mind that they had not harmed us yet. They could have if they wanted, but so far they had allowed us to walk through their area injury-free and alive. In addition, as I looked into the black eyes of this ancient creature, I got the sense there was not ill will between us. A calm feeling came over me. I felt like waving to it, but I thought better of it, and I stepped forward to the side, and me and Stick Boy walked right past this creature only 10 feet away. Now that's not 10 yards away, that's 10 feet away. That was very close. The creature's eyes and body followed us, and in a minute we were both looking behind us, watching and hoping that it would not attack. The attack never came, and we were headed to the car in safety. The walk to the car was longer than I estimated. It took us maybe 30 minutes to reach the edge of the woods, and we were tracked the whole way, but this time we could see our escorts. I know I saw 3 shapes in the distance keeping pace with us. It was now 9 a.m. and the sun was shining fully. The woods were now lit and I could see daylight at the edge of the field where we had parked. Only a few more yards and we were home free. I stopped short of the field and I turned to get one more look at these magnificent creatures. But the woods were still other than a few leaves gently moving in the breeze. They were all gone. My buddy and I were talking the whole time. We never made an effort to be quiet. Again, I won't repeat what we said, but it was more or less, can you believe this? With about 500 profane words to clutter the air around us. We were teenage boys. We broke through into the field and there was the car just as we had left it. On each side of the car, a tree had been bent to the ground, not blocking our way, and not a branch of the tree laid on the car. The trees made a perfect slot as if it were a parking spot. I closed the door, turned the ignition, and the engine started, and we were headed home. My friend and I graduated high school that next May. We went off to different schools and eventually moved back to our hometown. We are still best of friends and good business associates. We have lunch every Thursday at the same local diner in our small Mississippi town. We talk about that day maybe about once a year. What else is there to say? We both saw this, and we know no one's going to believe us. And then one of our boys from Mississippi started telling these stories on the internet. We figured we could trust you with this, Cam, so there you have it. Thanks, guys. Appreciate that. In 1998, that land went up for sale. I figured if it got sold, whoever bought it would sell the hardwood off of it. So I bought it and another 500 acres around it, and no timber will be cut as long as I'm alive. Half of the land is leased to farmers. No hunting is allowed. I keep the food plots growing, but I don't hunt over them. My friend and I go into those woods a few times a year. Sometimes together and sometimes alone. We leave a bag of apples, a few fresh ears of corn, maybe some hard candy left over from the holidays. I still get that calm feeling when I'm in there, and it's a good place to be. What a story! Woo! I'm not going to say anything else. I'll just mess it up. Great story, man. I really appreciate you sending it to me, and I actually know this guy. I know who he is. He's a very successful business guy, and he and his family have done really well, and his buddy, I know his buddy, and they've all done really well, and I had no idea. I had no idea they had this experience. I got this email, I don't know, maybe about a month ago, and I just, I kind of struggled whether to share it or not, but I decided I'd go ahead and do it, so I don't think anybody's going to put it together who he is. But anyway, it's a great story, and I thought I'd share it with you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. An email from Daryl. I was not a believer in Bigfoot until August of 1969. I was out picking huckleberries with my wife, my brother, and 2 of his friends when I changed my mind. We were picking berries and minding our own business when we heard gunfire and bullets started flying just over our heads. My wife said, "I think someone wants us to move." My brother and one of his friends agreed. "It's not worth dying over," they said. So we all got in our vehicles and we went up the road. While my brother and his friends stayed at their truck and made themselves something to eat, my wife and I decided to go check out the area for huckleberries. We found a great spot and we started picking. There was a big old stump that looked kind of like a bear not far from me, so I thought I'd have some fun with my wife, and I said, "Hey, look at that bear." Then it got up, all 8 feet of it. It stretched for a minute, and then it started walking towards us. I realized it wasn't a bear, it was a Bigfoot. "It's not a bear," I yelled at my wife as I tore off down the trail. "It's a Bigfoot, and it's coming right at us." My wife looked up as I flew past her and took one look. Oh, you ran right past your wife, brother. You made a big mistake. My wife looked up as I flew past her, took one look at what I was running from, and took off right behind me. We ran all the way back to the truck where my brother and his friends were still eating. We told them what we had seen, but all they did was laugh at us. We didn't care. We got in our car and drove home. If my brother and his friends wanted to stay and picnic with Bigfoot, that was their problem. That happened at Swan Lake Mountain in Montana. My wife and I thought it would be our one and only Bigfoot encounter, but we were wrong. It was only 2 weeks later when we decided to go camping at Lake Mary Ronan that we had our second. We got to the campground only to find it was full, so we decided to go up past a Christian camp we knew of, and we found a great spot there. Our 6-year-old and 3.5-month-old sons were with us, and so was our dog Toby. Our 6-year-old was really into riding his bike, so we brought it too. Whenever our son was on his bike, our dog loved running beside him. We thought it was pretty strange when he didn't want to this time. I told him to go on, boy, and gestured for him to follow my son, but he just looked up at me. I said, go on, go with your boy. And again, I gestured. This time, reluctantly, the dog followed my son, but it was pretty obvious that he didn't like it. Meanwhile, my wife and I went about setting up camp. We were situated with a big meadow to our left, the lake in front of us, and the woods were behind us. We decided to go to the woods and collect some firewood. We were following a well-worn trail when my wife noticed a pine tree that had been snapped off about 10 feet up from the ground. Maybe the wind blew it off, I said. But then we saw the tree top in an 8-foot by 4-foot wide hole with the pine cones and needles. It looked like something was making a soft bed. We could see big footprints all around it, maybe 15 to 16 inches long. I wear a size 13, and these were bigger and a lot deeper than my footprints. My wife remembered our recent encounter at Swan Lake Mountain, and she wanted to leave. I tried to talk her into staying, but she was having none of it. She couldn't shake the memory of what we saw before. To make matters worse, our dog was scared and shaking and wouldn't come out from under the pickup. Finally, I said, okay, let's eat, and then we can pack up and go home. After we ate, my wife was using our stroller to help get things back into the vehicle, and I was packing the tent. She asked me if I could help her for a minute, and I had just said, yeah, just a second, when a powerful bad odor overtook the campsite. Do you smell that? I asked my wife. Yes, she said, scrunching up her nose at the smell. I started packing the tent a little faster while she put the boys in the truck. At that moment, an ear-piercing, body-shaking, screaming roar broke through the air, sending chills all down our bodies. I grabbed the tent, no longer concerned with packing it, ran over to the truck, and then threw it in the back. My wife picked up that stroller full of stuff like it was nothing and slung it into the back too. We piled into the truck with our dog and got the heck out of there, with branches and rocks and nuts and all kind of things being thrown at our vehicle all the way. It would be another 25 years before we would go camping again. Here's an email from Donald from Middle Tennessee. I got this little less than a year ago. Here's what he writes. I was raised in a very rural area of southeastern Middle Tennessee on the Cumberland Plateau. The area, like much of Appalachia, was a mining community. The coal mines were the main employer in the town and the center of the community. The mines closed back in the late 80s and things were never the same. The younger people who live here now would not have recognized the place back in the 70s. We had train depots, a walk-in theater, and a drive-in theater. None of these are around today. I want to share a story with you which happened all the way back in the early 70s. I had aunts, uncles, and cousins who were several years older than me, and had 2 aunts in particular who were identical twins. They and a couple of our female cousins went to the drive-in theater to see a movie one summer on a Friday night. Back in those days, there were no all-night gas stations or convenience stores, so after about 7 p.m., everything was closed. On this particular night, the four girls were coming home from the movies around 11 p.m., and just before they got home, the car ran out of gas. Fortunately, the area where they ran out of gas was a quarter-mile from our uncle's house, so they decided to walk up there and stay the night and go out in the morning and get some gas. Where this uncle lived was near a place commonly called the Big Mines. This mine had shut down back in the 30s, but people would often go up there to ride motorcycles and four-wheel drives. There was a landfill near there where everyone took their trash. At the landfill was a small cave, which always had a horrible odor, even worse than the smell of garbage. No one ever went into the cave. In fact, no one ever went near it. On this night, the girls started walking down the long dirt road in the moonlight. There were no streetlights in the area in those days and very few houses. After they had gone just a little way down the road, one of my aunts remembered that she had left her purse in the car, and she ran back to get it. She got to the car, reached in, got her purse, and started walking back to meet the other girls. As she was walking towards them, they started screaming, "Run, run, it's after you!" She thought they were messing with her, so she stopped and looked at them sarcastically. As they continued to scream at her, she felt as though something was behind her. She looked over her shoulder, and there, a few feet behind her, was a large, white, ape-like creature standing there with its arms stretched out towards her. She began to scream and run as fast as she could. The creature followed behind them as they ran. The screaming and yelling woke my uncle and his sons, and they came to the front yard with their guns in hand. When my uncle turned on the porch light, the creature stopped and tried to shield its face from the light with its arms. My uncle and his son started to fire at the creature, which turned and ran into the woods screaming and bellowing. They heard it screeching and bellowing all through the night, and they stayed up keeping a watch for it, but it never returned. The next morning, my uncle took the girls to town and bought gas for their car. I was only about 10 years old when this happened, and my aunts told me the story themselves. You could see the fear in their eyes as they talked about it. Later that year, I found a book in my school library entitled On the Track of Bigfoot by Marion T. Place. In that book, she related the story of many people in southern Tennessee and northern Alabama who had seen an albino Bigfoot. Thank you for sharing people's stories. Signed, Don. I just love these old stories. I love them. I know it scared your aunt and your aunts to death, but good grief, what a great story. Don, thanks for sending it. I know we all enjoyed it. Thank you, man. Here's an email from a woman in southwest Louisiana, and she wants to keep her name out of it, but I think she's going to hear this, and I just want to tell her, I wish I could tell y'all her name, because it's one of the coolest names. I've never heard it before, but it's a pretty name. It's really a good name. I don't know why that stuck in my head, but I just thought I'd let you know. Even though I can't tell you her name, she has a really pretty name. It's unusual. Okay, enough of that. She writes, I live in southwest Louisiana in a very rural area. We have 80 acres here, and we have cattle and horses. I have no close neighbors. The nearest neighbor is a half-mile away. There are large farms surrounding our property where the neighbors also raise cows and horses. On March 11th or 12th of this year, 2020, I had my encounter. I went out on my porch with my binoculars to scan the fields for our cows. We had some newborn calves at the time, and I try to keep a watch on them when they're really young. Having spotted them and all being well, I started scanning the neighbor's field to the south. He has an 80-acre parcel with cattle as well. I spotted a dead cow surrounded by a few buzzards in the middle of his field. And then something caught my eye. It was something very tall and huge in size. It had to have been 7 to 8 feet tall. I was looking across our large yard and then across their back 40 acres. It was there further on into another piece of land and in a clearing that was only about 20 feet wide. I was so startled I couldn't make any sense of what I was seeing. It started walking and it was on 2 feet. It walked to the east from the west out of my line of sight and into some brush, and within 30 seconds it had turned around and come back into my view. Then a second one walked up to it from the west, and they both walked back to the west into the large thicket, and I couldn't see them anymore. The second one was just a little shorter than the first one. I could see the fence as a reference point for size, and I really do think they could have almost stepped over the fence. They were both dark, maybe even black in color, really dark and shaggy. They were built really large and broad-shouldered with long arms. I couldn't make out facial features at that distance. The leaves were still off the trees here, so I could see them clearly through my binoculars even though they were quite far away. I hightailed it back inside my house in stunned disbelief. I can't explain the feeling that I had. I was shaking and I just couldn't wrap my brain around this. I called my husband, who was out of town at the time, and probably made very little sense at first. I had just gone all to pieces. I have since done a little research and watched several videos about Bigfoot, and I'm wondering if anyone knows or thinks maybe they were attracted by the dead cow in my neighbor's field. Has anyone ever seen a Bigfoot eating dead animals or roadkill even? Please know that Bigfoot was the last thing on earth that I thought I would see that day, much less 2 of them. I love your videos, and I chose you to read my story because you are my favorite. You are my favorite, and tell it just like it is. I don't know why that makes me giggle. Please keep me anonymous if you read my story, no problem. It's a true story, but I'm just not ready to deal with people thinking I'm nuts. I'll keep my eyes open and I'll write and let you know if I see them again. I'm hoping my husband has an encounter from a far distance. I just want someone else to see them besides me. Thank you for letting me share my story. Oh, what a great encounter. See, that's the kind of encounter I want. I want to be looking across the field on a sunny day and see these 2 big black, huge hulking figures walking across the field and know that I've had a Bigfoot encounter, and that's what this woman has had. She's had a real brief encounter, just like I was talking about a while back in the video, that most of these encounters, I bet you, are like this. They're just brief, fleeting moments where people catch a glimpse of something that they know is not a human. They know it's nothing else that they've ever seen before, just like this encounter, and they're just blown away by it, and it changes the way you look at things. It would for me. I mean, if I saw something like this walking across my yard, it would change my whole worldview about wildlife and things that we know and things that we don't know. And I think that's why these type of encounters are so special. And and I'm her favorite. Miss C, you're my favorite too. You're my favorite writer today, and I really appreciate it. But I really love this story, and I could tell just from her writing how excited she was. And I bet if I could get to talk to her, she would just be going on and on and on about it, because it does just blow you away when you see something strange like this. So I love this story, and I wanted to get it in this video, and I know everyone enjoyed it. So thank you, ma'am, for sending it. This story is from Ron. In 1970, I was fishing in the phosphate pits around the Fort Meade Mulberry area. I was running trot lines for catfish and turtles. I always carried my .22 rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun because I would shoot coots for bait. I did a lot of small game hunting and I was a really good shooter. One evening, about 2 hours before sunset, I was looking for coots for bait. Driving along a gravel-top road, I came up to a small pond with a single cypress tree in the middle. The pond was about 40 feet from the road and almost perfectly round and nearly 50 yards in diameter. And on the far side, I saw a single coot walking at the edge of the water. I took a shot and I killed it. I walked around to the far side of the pond, and before I got to the coot, I saw a line of tracks coming out of the pond. They were human-looking tracks, but they were huge. I could tell by the impressions that the tracks were headed out of the pond. I didn't see any tracks going into the pond on my way around it, and I continued to walk around the pond to see where it had entered. Coming all the way back around, I saw nothing, and I wondered how it got in the pond. I searched 50 feet in front of my car and then 50 feet behind my car, and I still saw nothing. I looked to the other side of the road up and down. It was all undisturbed brush. I went back to the tracks and I looked at them and I realized that they were not only huge, but they were quite far apart. The sand along the bank was wet and hard, and the tracks were twice as deep as my tracks. As I tried to step from one to the next, I had to stretch so far to the next one that I could not take another step without falling. The tracks went up a slight hill and leveled out and went in almost a straight line towards the pine and palmetto forest. This thing had left tracks almost 14 to 15 inches deep in the sand, and I was beginning to feel like it had to be a Bigfoot. I reached the edge of the pines and I saw a trail through the palmettos that had been completely smashed down. Thinking hard about whether I should follow the tracks, curiosity got the best of me and I started walking slowly into the trees. A few feet in, I felt the hairs on my neck start to tingle. I stopped and looked around, and off to my left I saw two huge eyes 8 inches apart looking right into my eyes. They were kind of yellowish gold with a very thin black line all the way around the dark black center. I was not able to move, but I didn't feel any fear, nor did I feel threatened. I was almost at peace. I don't know how long I stood there looking at it. All I saw were its eyes. Apparently it was crouching down behind the palmettos. I was looking into the eyes and I remembered I had my .22 rifle, and I thought I would definitely not have enough firepower, and if I tried to shoot it, it would just make it mad. I started walking backwards, almost tripping over the palmettos. When I reached the sand, I ran back to the car. I got in my car and I locked the doors, and I sat there trying to make sense of what just happened. Suddenly I felt another calm come over me. I had the same feeling while I looked into the creature's eyes. I felt a change had happened to me, and my take on life was different somehow. I was looking at life in general in a whole new way. It made me a better person in a strange way. From that day on, I have had a way with all animals. I've read a lot of stories about these beings, most of which are not out to harm people, but I've heard that some of them are aggressive. Thankfully, the one I saw was only as curious as I was. Oh, Ron, that's a good story. I really like these good stories where people have a good experience with these things, because it just puts a whole different air on the thing, or a whole different mood over the thing. And that's cool. You had an encounter with a strange creature and it kind of changed the way you look at wildlife and animals. I like this story, buddy. I'm really glad you sent it. Thanks, Ron. This writer's name is John, and he writes, I grew up in the Red River Valley near Texarkana, Texas, on the Arkansas side. My father was a soybean and cotton farmer, and we had 1,500 acres in the Choctaw Bayou near the town of Foreman. I was 5 years old and had been sick for several days, and my father and my brothers had gone to Texarkana to get parts for their motorcycles. The dealership had a little Honda 50 mini trail bike, and my brothers talked my dad into getting it for me. They brought it home and called me from inside the house. Wow, was I happy. Needless to say, I got well very fast. I rode that bike all over that farm. The Choctaw Bayou ran behind our house and divided the farm. When you crossed the bridge over the bayou, it was like instantly eyes were on you. I always had an uneasy feeling in there. One spring day, I was on my motorcycle and I rode across the bayou. There was a small grove of very large pecan trees a short distance into the bottom. I rode under the trees and I turned off my bike to watch for squirrels in the pecan trees. The bayou bank was only about 30 feet away. Looking into the bayou, I saw what looked like a big black stump that hadn't been there before, and then the stump stood up. It turned and it looked at me. Its eyes were golden brown and very soft. It stood for only a moment and it turned and walked down the bayou and out of sight. I don't remember much after that, but I never felt afraid. At that young age, I knew about my Native American heritage. We had 2 Indian burial mounds on our property, and I thought the creature was there to watch over the mounds. I never told anyone about my encounter until I was about 35 years old. The subject of the Fouke monster came up one day, and my brother said that he had had strange things happen to him when he was working or hunting on the backside of that bayou. When I told him about my encounter, he actually teared up because he knew that there was something in there as well. It seems when you have an experience like this, more encounters happen throughout your life. I find this odd. I'm now 52 years old, and I've had many more encounters, and I've dedicated most of my life to being an avid outdoorsman. Here's an email from someone I think wants to be anonymous. I'm not sure, but I'm not going to say his name just to be safe. Here's what he writes. It's been 5 years since this happened. Although I didn't actually see anything, I can't just explain away what happened either. I guess that's why it stays with me to this day. I bought a fifth wheel located in Henderson, Texas. It was parked in an RV camp just outside of town. The park was surrounded by a large, fairly dense forest, and there were about 15 other RVs parked there as well, with the woods behind us. I had never stayed in an RV before. I bought it to get out of the city and rest. I'm a retired nurse. I was glad to get out of the city and travel for a while. I had my dog with me, my buddy and traveling companion of 13 years, Roscoe. Roscoe and I enjoyed going for long walks. Sometimes we'd venture into the forest behind the fifth wheel. It was quiet back there and peaceful. It had a calming effect on me. At times, though, it could be a little spooky. It was almost like I could feel eyes watching me. There was one event during my stay in that area that I will never forget. Roscoe and I were off on one of our walks. We decided to take the trail leading into the forest. We took our usual walk around and then started back up the trail. Suddenly, Roscoe whined softly. He stood alert, sniffing something beyond my senses. The hair stood up on his back as he stared deeper into the forest. I couldn't tell what he was seeing or smelling or sensing. Not knowing what he knew only served to make me even more nervous. Then his tail went down, the hair on his back stood more rigid, and his neck fluffed up. He had a look that I've only seen when he doesn't like whatever he's seeing. It was a warning look of danger. I softly said his name, and in response he whined again and looked straight forward as if to say, "Mom, there's something out there." Roscoe will chase cats, and he's been known to be slightly protective of me around strangers, but this was more than usual. It was something different. He was truly spooked, and he stood there for a few more minutes, but I couldn't see or hear anything. Eventually, we moved up on the road to my trailer. That night was a little weird as well. I like to go out on my porch and sit. There's something truly magical about the sounds of the crickets and night birds in chorus with the tree frogs and the katydids. It was a nice way to end each day, but that night there were no sounds. It was deathly quiet. There were no crickets, no birds or anything. Rather than being relaxing, it was a bit nerve-wracking. The next day, when Roscoe and I took our walk, we started down the trail into the woods again. This time there was a small tree branch leaned over the trail. It wasn't like it had broken and fallen. It was damaged. It was just leaned over to block the trail. I thought it was rather peculiar, and Roscoe was acting funny again. He was looking down the trail and acting like he didn't want to go into the forest. And I decided we'd take a different route for the next few days and check out the camp instead. That evening, I took my usual seat outside of my trailer. This time I heard some weird breaking noises in the forest behind me, but I didn't get up to investigate. The hair was standing up on the back of my neck, and I got this really creepy feeling that I couldn't shake. I left there a week later for better camping spots. While we were there, I never actually saw anything or even really heard anything other than some breaking sounds. But that was one that stayed with me and probably always will. Thank you for reading this. It was nice to share it with someone. Thanks for sharing it. You know, these are little things that happen to people in the woods, and they bother them forever. And I know how good it is just to tell the story. And so, you know, you're free to send your stories like this. This was a good one. She wrote it really well, and I was almost there with her. It was brief and to the point, but it's just a good letter. And thank you very much for sending it.
This Bigfoot story comes from a lady who asked to remain anonymous, and she says it's true. In the spring of 1978, I was grateful to be invited to Altoona, Georgia with my baby girl for a holiday weekend. It was a nice break from a marriage I was beginning to realize was made in hell. Baby girl was cutting teeth and as such was fussy that weekend. So my brother-in-law decided we would need our very own tent, set up at the extreme right end of the camping spot. We unloaded and put things into place, cooked, and enjoyed the view. This was Friday night, so folks wouldn't be piling in until the morning. Also, my brother-in-law was familiar with the place and had reserved a pretty secluded spot for us. With supper came all the fun stories people tell around campfires, along with the promises of the great fishing and playing in the water we could expect in the morning. Eventually it was time for bed, so baby girl and I went to our little tent and settled in. She was still being pretty fussy, but I finally got her to sleep about dark 30. A storm blew up on us, and I was awake in an instant. So was the fussy girl. The wind blew, lightning flashed, and rain pounded our tent. After about 15 minutes, the worst of the storm passed, and it was just raining, but now baby girl was awake, and fussy, again. I was still breastfeeding, so I tried that first. Then I tried her juice bottle, and finally her pacifier. Nothing worked. She just kept fussing and crying. At this point, I started to notice that baby girl's cries came with an echo. She would let loose with a wail, and then it would echo back. I tried lulling her to sleep with a song, and right away I picked up on the fact that that didn't echo. Now I was beginning to hear rustling in the bushes behind us. I could hear the sound of sticks breaking and limbs. By now I had ruled out echoes, even though it sounded just like her. At one point, she even raised up and looked at me as if to say, "What's that?" The rustling got closer, and the echo started coming from directly behind our tent. I began to see shadows cast on the tent from the lights of the nearby bathrooms. I was petrified. My brother-in-law unzipped his tent and asked if we were okay. I said yes, but he said my baby's cries are annoying. I said she's teething. He said, "What?" I repeated. He couldn't hear me, and after the third attempt, He simply laughed, zipped his tent closed again, and went back to bed. The conversation must have been enough to scare off whatever was out there, because the echo stopped and I didn't hear any more rustling in the bushes. Eventually, I got baby girl to settle down, and I got a couple of hours of sleep that night. Saturday night was a repeat of Friday night minus the storm. Baby girl would cry out, and then I would hear an echo of her cry. The rustling in the bushes and the snapping of the limbs repeated as well. By Sunday morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I got the nerve to bring it up, hoping someone else had heard something, but I just got laughed at and had to endure a barrage of jokes. Sunday night was the most frightening. Baby girl cried out and was echoed. Then the rustling of bushes and breaking of sticks and branches came. This was the worst night for baby girl's teething as well. She was in a lot of pain and I couldn't keep her quiet, but there was no way I was going to walk around with her outside that tent. As I sat there, rocking and soothing my baby daughter, I looked up and saw a shadow on the back of the tent. The baby screamed and the echo repeated exactly like her cry. The shadow just moved side to side, playing the echo game. I didn't smell anything and I couldn't tell how tall it was. It was just very stout. The night dragged on for hours, with me sitting there holding my baby close and not knowing what to do. I almost peed myself when the shadow touched the tent and started mumbling. Baby girl was still crying, so it was impossible to tell what it was saying or if it was saying anything intelligible. It sounded something like mo dit. It lasted until baby girl finally fell asleep. I dozed off, sitting up holding her in my arms. Monday morning finally arrived. With it came the gorgeous views of the lake, the awesome crisp freshness of the last morning meal, and the camaraderie of my breakfast companions before breaking down and packing up to go home. When my brother-in-law started breaking down my tent, he asked me, "Have you been walking around back here?" "No," I said. He started checking around and told me, "Well, something's been smashing the undergrowth and walking around back here." He looked at me, his face pale under his sunburn, and his eyes were as wide as saucers. I said, "Tell me the truth. It wasn't you just trying to scare me, was it?" He denied it, and my sister confirmed that it couldn't have been him. He'd had too much to drink each night to be out playing pranks. All the way home, my brother-in-law kept glancing over at me. I think he finally figured out that I wasn't joking with them. Years later, I learned that Bigfoot are known to make baby crying sounds in the woods. I could have fainted when I learned that.
I got an email from Kathy, and this is what she writes. "Hello, my name is Kathy, and I live in Charleston, West Virginia. I, too, have an encounter with a creature I could not explain. It was here in the mountains of West Virginia back in 1980 when I was 15 years old. Back then, I would go ginseng hunting with my dad and my grandpa out on my grandfather's homestead near the Clay and Nichols County line. The place was called Wilson Ridge near the mining town of Wyden, West Virginia. On the day in question, we started early, but it was already hot and muggy. My dad had ventured off the ridge, and my grandfather and I went in the opposite direction, on a trailhead going downhill towards a creek, where we would be in the shade. Papa had trained me to be a good woodsman, and I had been to the area we were in many times. So when he decided to venture out further on the mountaintop, he felt comfortable instructing me to go on down towards the water. I'd been walking along this path for about 30 minutes looking for ginseng when I came across some golden thread. It was also in season, so I stopped to pick some. I was down on my knees digging out the roots when I heard someone or something walking in the woods above me. I looked up, but I couldn't see anyone through the scrub brush. I called out, "Hey, who's up there?" The walking stopped, but there was no response. I listened for what was probably just a minute, but it felt like an hour. The woods were so quiet, not even a bird was chirping. I finally shrugged it off and got back to digging. I carried a little transistor radio with me, so I pulled it out of my bag, and I turned it on as I finished clearing out that patch, and then I moved to another one. As I worked, I sang along with the country music that cracked and popped out of the speaker of the little radio. I had turned it up loud, so I guess that's why I didn't hear anything walking up on me. All of a sudden, the hair began to stand up on the back of my neck, and I was overwhelmed by the feeling of being watched. No one was supposed to be out there on that property except me, my dad, and Pawpaw. "That's not funny, Dad," I yelled, and from somewhere to my right, a 5-pound rock flew out of the underbrush and landed about 2 feet from me. That got my attention. I stood straight up and I whistled really loud for Dad or Pawpaw to hear me. As an answer, a growling scream erupted from the underbrush from where the rock had been thrown. I burst into action, running down the hill as fast as I could. I left everything behind me, my tools, my bag of golden thread and ginseng, even my radio. I didn't stop until I got down to the creek where my dad had parked the truck. I reached under the back tire where a key was hidden and kept in a magnetic box. I grabbed it and I got inside and I locked the doors as I did. I started tapping out SOS on the truck's horn until I heard 3 shots from my dad's .22 pistol. We didn't have cell phones back then, so we had other more creative ways of communicating. A few minutes later, Dad came flying down the ridge, having fully understood that his little girl was either in trouble or injured. He found me crying and screaming and making very little sense. It took him a good half hour to calm me down enough to get the story out of me, and by then Pawpaw had joined us. Once I was able to make it clear what had happened, Pawpaw jumped into the driver's seat and drove us out of there without another word. We had crossed the river and were a half mile from home, which put us a good 10 miles from whatever this thing was, when Grandpa finally spoke and he said, "I guess the old man of the mountain doesn't want us back up there. I guess we won't be going back." But my dad did go back the very next day. He went to get my tools, my bag, and my radio. He found them in the place where we'd parked the truck the day before. My radio was still turned on and playing John Denver's Country Roads Take Me Home, of all things. I'm not afraid to go back in the woods, but I do have a respect for all the sentient beings living there. After that encounter, my dad and Pawpaw taught me to look for signs of the old mountain people, as they call them. I know now to recognize their territory and steer clear of it. Knowledge I've since passed on to my 2 sons. They're both good, strong mountain men who also respect the law of the mountains. Thank you for your time and God bless you, signed Kathy. Oh, wow, that was a great story. Let's see, that was in 1980. That's the year I graduated high school, so Kathy and I are about the same age. That's a scary story, but it's good that you guys kind of learned what was going on and you know what to do and you know to look for signs and you know to get out when it's time to get out. Kathy, that was so good. Thank you, ma'am. Here's an email from Lucas, and here's what he writes. My name is Lucas, and this encounter happened back in 2016 in Ontario, Canada. I went with my father to my uncle's hunting camp to help build the cottage. We stayed in a travel trailer. The first night, I had trouble falling asleep. I was uncomfortable, and I felt like something was watching me from outside. The next day, as we worked on the roof, I had the same feeling. I soon blew the feeling off, and we kept working. Later, my aunt arrived, and she had just gotten out of her car and was walking towards us when I saw a rock the size of a baseball come out of the woods 100 feet behind her. It buzzed over our heads and then over the house. My aunt stopped, looked around at the woods. She started walking towards us again, and she said, "Damn Bigfoots." I was surprised to hear her say that, and I asked her to repeat what she had said. She confirmed the word Bigfoot and went on to tell us that they threw stuff at her all the time, acorns and small stones, but she was a bit surprised one had thrown a big rock, and that was all she said about it. I just never pressed the subject. Later that day, my cousin showed up, so I had to sleep in the bed with my father. He went straight to sleep, but again I had trouble sleeping. That feeling was back. It took an hour for me to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke before everyone else, and it was still dark outside, and I should have gotten up, but again, something felt weird about the morning. I was turned on my side, and I could see out the window of the trailer. A scare light illuminated the area outside the window. Right then, a huge dark figure walked past. It was just at the edge of the light, but there was no mistaking that something big had walked past, and I remember the bird feeder my aunt had hanging outside swinging after this thing walked past. No one else was up. I heard snoring from all the men. They were still asleep, and I laid there until the others woke up. Finally, everyone was moving, so I got up. I dressed quickly and I jumped outside. I don't know exactly how high the bird feeder was off the ground, but I'm 5'8", and the bottom of the feeder was 1.5 feet above my head, making it around 7 feet off the ground. If this thing bumped the feeder with its shoulder, that meant if you add its head to that height, it was at least 8 feet tall. That is a massive creature. I never told anyone about what I saw that weekend, and I haven't talked about it since. I had actually forgotten about the event until I started listening to your podcast, and the memory came back. I wanted to get this to you before it slipped into my past again. Signed, Lucas. You know, everybody wants to hear these spectacular encounters, but I would say that most people who see these things just see glimpses. I would imagine if I was in the woods and I encountered a Bigfoot, which I never have, but if I did, I would see it walking away or walking, from left to right, right to left, and see it move behind the trees, and then it would be gone. They're real fast, non-eventful, non-violent encounters. I think most people probably have those. You're driving in the car and you see something on the side of the road, or you see something cross the road, and walk up a bank or whatever. But this is exactly what this was. He's laying there in the bed and he's looking out the window, and this huge hulking creature walks by and bumps a bird feeder that's 7 feet off the ground. And he distinctly remembers the bird feeder swinging and probably bird feed falling out of it as the thing walked by. I thought it was smart at such a young age that he went out and estimated the height of this thing based on the height of the bird feeder. It's pretty smart, pretty innovative for Lucas there. Buddy, I appreciate the email. This is a great story, and I know we all enjoyed it. Thank you. Here's a short little story that I got from Cheryl. Cheryl's from Mississippi, and here's what she writes. I'm from Mississippi originally, but I've lived in Oklahoma, Texas, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. Since I've discovered the subject of Sasquatch, I'm so sure that they're real. I don't need to see one, believe me. But here is my second-hand story. My mom and her siblings made up a huge family who lived on a plantation in Sunflower County. Mom always called it the Patterson Plantation because there were more daughters than sons in this family. Mom and her sisters always worked with their dad in the field hoeing cotton. The boys were too young. The girls were about 8 to 12 years of age, and they were hard workers. Mom would tell us that when their dad was sick, the girls would go to the field by themselves. They were just carrying on for Daddy. The only thing that truly spooked them was the fact that something on 2 legs would pace them. The girls would be on a dirt road which was flanked on either side by the Sunflower River or the forest. This animal would pace them just out of sight in the forest. Mom said one time they asked my grandpa, "Daddy, what is that walking next to us?" He grinned and said, "It's just a bunch of squirrels." This went on for a while. It never showed its face. And yes, if it had been a vagrant or an escapee from Parchman, surely he would have been seen at some point. The girls were not the only ones who heard this noise. Mom said other adults in the field would also walk the same direction, and they also heard the noises. But to top this off, my mom's family all lived in a little shotgun house that had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. The kitchen door was secured by a thumb lock. At night, Mom said someone would open the kitchen door, walk across the linoleum kitchen floor to their bedroom. All the girls slept in one bed. They would walk around the bed and stroke the girls' heads. Mom says she always wanted to know who was doing this, so the next time it happened, she jumped up and she hit the lights. She wasn't quick enough, though, darn it. Anyway, I just thought I would pass this along before I forget about it. Keep up the good work, signed Cheryl. Well, Cheryl, it's permanently out there on the internet now, and your memory is locked in stone. And that, what do you think that was, stroking all those girls' heads? You think it was their daddy? You think it was their dad walking in and just, because I used to do that with my daughter. When they were asleep, I'd just go in and look at my kids and just rub their head. Maybe that's what it was, but that does not explain whatever was tracking them in the woods or along that riverbank when they would walk down that road. But it's a great story and a great memory, Cheryl. Thanks for sending it to us. I know that we all appreciate it. Thanks. Here's an email from a man in Louisiana about a turkey hunt in Arkansas. He wants to stay anonymous, and here's what he writes. I was 15 at the time of this encounter. I'm 28 years old now. My dad and I would travel to Arkansas and turkey hunt for a week or 2 during the spring. We had a camp set up with 5 or 6 others we would always meet up with every year and park campers in an open area on top of a mountain. I don't remember the location. We had been there almost a week and almost everybody had had great success hunting. Any trash we accumulated would be put in trash bags and hung up high in the tree to keep them out of reach of black bears. One morning we woke up early to go eat in my uncle's camper before we set off on our individual hunts. I got dressed and was the first to step outside that morning. It was still dark and barely any moonlight through the thick canopy of trees. As soon as I went down the steps onto the ground, I heard a grunting sound from something big to my right a few yards away. I froze, thinking I had spooked a bear, but the sound was much deeper than a bear and oddly enough reminded me of an ape-like sound. I turned to look that direction and whatever it was standing beside the tree where we had our trash hung up. I could only see a dark mass there, and within a second or two, it grunted once more and took off sprinting up the ridge away from camp. My dad walked outside by this time and we could hear this thing running and tearing up any and everything in its path. We stood there in silence for a long time listening to this beast crash its way up the mountain, and then it was gone. My dad asked me what it was and I told him I think it was a bear. I had no idea how to rationalize the shape I saw in the dark or the size or the noises I heard before it ran off. I didn't think there was anything that big in the woods of Arkansas, but after thinking about it for a few years, it was much bigger than a black bear. I recently brought this story up to my dad for the first time, and I told him I really wasn't sure what I had seen. It turns out that one of the guys we would camp with there had had 2 encounters himself and has even been interviewed by the BFRO. I wish I had more details to give, but I honestly have no other explanation as to what this could have been. I don't know if you'll find this interesting enough for your channel, but I just figured I'd put it out there. Brother, thanks for sending that. Yes, it's interesting. They're all interesting. I love them all. We all love them all. And this was good. I've spent years camping in campers and tents and big fifth wheels and pop-ups and stuff like that all my life. I don't camp much anymore. But that moment when you walk out of the camper or the tent or whatever you've been staying in and it's still dark and you step out into the cold morning or even a summer morning, that first assessment of everything around you is always, it's not spooky, but it's just, there's something, you always check, you always look around, you look at everything, you make sure there's not some monster standing there close to the camper. I don't know what it is, but I've always been that way since a kid. And so I know exactly what you're talking about. You step out and you're looking around, you hear this grunt, then this big figure standing beside a tree and it crashes up the mountain for 5 minutes. I mean, good grief. Not many people experience that. But anyway, I thought it was a great story and I really appreciate you sending it. It was a good one. Here's an encounter from Central Texas. The author's name is Angela, and here's what she writes. I never dreamt in a million years that I would ever have an experience, let alone speak of it, but I feel comfortable to tell it. The only ones who know about it are my mother, my son, my daughter, and myself, and now you. I am a believer of many things. I believe in the paranormal. I believe that dreams come true. I believe people may have seen something, but a Bigfoot? I wasn't sure what to think of this. I wasn't sure until 2015, that is. We moved from Houston to Central Texas, and the way best to describe it was a neighborhood, but it was a country version of a neighborhood, where each property was at least an acre, give or take. We had wildlife out there, and I was quite excited to see wild deer in our front yard. And of course, we would hear a bobcat and hear coyotes occasionally. I am a single mom of 2 beautiful adult children. My youngest girl has a disability. It's like dealing with a giant 4-year-old. I'm very close to my mother, and we all decided that we wanted to live together. We moved into a huge 4-bedroom manufactured home, and let's just say that we could meet in the kitchen and would be halfway through the house, and basically each side of the home had the privacy of a 2-bedroom apartment. One night I was outside with my son walking one of our German Shepherds. I adore German Shepherds, and we have 3 of them, and a pit bull puppy, and they're all rescues. Good for you. I love people who rescue dogs, Angela. We spent a lot of time outside. One of the gentlemen that used to live around the neighborhood stopped in the road, and he told us that we shouldn't be out there in the night. In his words, there's a big animal that roams around here. We assumed that he was either messing with us or he was talking about a big coyote or even a mountain lion that had been seen in the town next to us. My son and I said, "Thank you, but I think we'll be okay." He said, "Trust me, you won't be if this thing comes out." At that point, we knew he was being overdramatic. Maybe he was even drunk. One night, my son was out, and I was in the kitchen having a cup of coffee with my mother and talking about some plans we had the following day. My daughter came in and announced that she saw a big man looking in her window. We assumed that she had been dreaming, and we treated it like that. She said, "No, Mom, it was a big man outside, and he was looking in. It's a monster man." My mother mentioned that my son had been allowing her to watch scary movies while he was supposed to be watching her, and now she was having nightmares. So I asked, "What did the monster look like?" And she said that he had red eyes that glowed and long hair on his face, that he looked really scary. Well, none of that made sense, but she slept with her grandmother that night and all was quiet. My daughter attends a school for adults with disabilities. My mother had taken her there the next morning, and I asked my son if he had allowed his sister to watch a scary movie. He said, "No, Mom, I would never do that." I told him what she said, and my son became concerned and looked around the house and under the window, but we found no evidence of anything being there. 4 nights later, while my son was out walking our shepherd, he caught a horrible odor in the area. We assumed it was a septic tank, but my son said the odor was much worse than that. Suddenly, the dogs began to growl and pace around at the front door. They wanted out. They did this when they knew deer were in the yard, and I was afraid they were going to start barking and annoy us for the next hour. But they never did bark. They acted different than when a deer was close. Their hackles were raised and they were all growling, a really strange growl. I had never heard them do this. I pushed past the dogs to look out the window, fully expecting to see deer in the yard. But instead, I saw what looked like a giant man. It took a step forward and it triggered the motion lights on the front of the house. And there it was, fully illuminated in the glow of the security light. I could not speak or move. I think my mouth was hanging open trying to speak, but I couldn't form the words. My son was beside me looking out the adjacent window. He immediately reached for me and pulled me away from the door and closed everything up, and then he checked all the locks. My mom yelled and said to call the police, and my response was, "What are we going to say? What do I say, Mom? That a monster was in my front yard?" My son had left the room, and soon he returned loading his grandfather's deer rifle. And then we heard a gunshot in the distance, and everything got quiet. We never went out to investigate, and that night was a fitful night of sleep. Not much of us got any sleep at all. And I don't know what got into the dogs, but for the rest of the night they stayed away from the front door. Maybe they recognized the odor, or maybe they knew what this thing was, but they were not interested in going out. Still today, they will not go out into the front yard, only out back where they are inside a fence. The following day, we ran into that strange neighbor my son and I had seen that one night and had stopped by, and he said, "I told you that thing was big, didn't I?" And I asked, "What was that thing?" And he said, "You saw it, didn't you? You know what it was." And then he drove away. It was really weird. After that night, we never saw it again. There are times when I think it was near, though. The dogs always let us know when something was not right. News reports were on TV about Bigfoot sightings in central Texas soon after this happened, and they continued sporadically for a year. Even after seeing the creature that night, and then backed up by the strange man and the news reports, I still had a hard time believing that it was a Bigfoot. I rationalized that it was a prank. We live in a college town, and maybe, I thought, some local kids were just playing a joke. But I remember how big this thing was, every bit of 8 to 9 feet tall, and it was very broad in the shoulders. And there were those red eyes. They were not fake, they were real. I don't know any college kids that are 8 or 9 feet tall, so I ruled that out. The reports I saw on the local news and on the internet began to concern me, and I began to believe that it was a Bigfoot. We have become believers since then. We didn't stay there much longer. Within a year, we moved away. Not because of the Bigfoot. We made the decision to get closer to the city for my daughter and my mother. I have not discussed this with anyone outside the family. This is the first time that I have made the event known. It feels good to get it off my chest, but I will admit that as I type this, the memories and panic of that night are flooding back. My hands are shaking here on the keyboard. It was all so shocking, and then when I saw my son walking in the room loading that rifle, I knew things were serious. After careful thought, though, I do not think the creature meant us any harm. It made no aggressive gestures towards us. I think it may have been passing through or just wandering, and our yard provoked its curiosity. Thanks for allowing me to share my story, signed Angela. Angela, whoa, great story. I'm kind of curious if you've heard of any more activity in that area. I don't think you moved very far from where all this happened. If there's been any more activity, let me know. All that said, this is a great story. This thing lights up in the security light, and you see it just full on. You saw red eyes. You saw how big it was. It's a great description of the creature, the way you feel about it, and how you kind of came to grips with what this thing really was. Angela, you did a great job. I really appreciate it. Thanks. This is an email I got pretty recently. It's kind of an exciting. I think you'll get a kick out of this story. Let's put it that way. The writer wants to be anonymous, and he writes, "Here's the story of the time that I killed a Bigfoot. I grew up on a farm in southern Indiana. I left for college in the early 90s with several friends that I grew up with. Until this phase of my life, I had never had access to cable TV. Reruns of In Search Of was my favorite show, and I watched them all the time. One afternoon in September, I was watching an episode on Bigfoot. Some buddies stopped by and they wanted me to go play basketball with them. I told them I would after the show was over, so they all sat around waiting on me. The show I was watching was on Bigfoot, and they started giving me crap about believing in Bigfoot, even though I told them I didn't believe. I just liked the show. October rolled around, and it was now harvest season, and I was helping, driving a combine until way after dark, shelling corn. I caught wind of a prank that these guys were going to play on me from my friend Billy. The plan was for Billy to put on a Bigfoot suit they had found at a novelty store. After dark, while I was driving the combine, Billy, in the Bigfoot suit, was to rush the combine, climb the ladder, and slap the glass, and then run away. They thought it would be real funny to scare me like that. It might have worked, but we were about to turn the tables on them. The next night, I was shelling corn in a field by the river. Just another night of work as far as my buddies were concerned. Billy had ridden his four-wheeler to the end of the field in his costume while the other guys waited inside the woods to watch as he scared the crap out of me, or so they thought. In the bright headlights of the machine, I knew they saw him run to the combine, and then he was out of view. That was my cue. I stopped. I got out on the landing, and I fired several shots with my .223 Ruger. I waited a few seconds and then emptied the magazine. It sounded like a real battle going on. Billy quickly removed his costume and laid it on the ground in front of the combine. I pulled forward a few feet and I lowered the corn head down on top of it just as the others raced toward the combine. They all ran around front and in silence looked at the costume buried under the equipment. I acted like I was panicking and I was talking real fast as if I had just killed a Bigfoot. Their faces were as white as a sheet and they never said a word. They just stared at the front of that machine, mouth breathing. Suddenly, a beer can popped behind them, making them jump. They quickly turned to see Billy standing there, beer raised in the air as he took a big gulp. And that was the night that I killed a Bigfoot. Oh, man, what a great story. Oh, you got those guys perfect. I've always wanted to get a Bigfoot suit and do some funny videos, like that. But the minute you put on one of those suits is, this was just a prank. You firing that .223 off just to scare those guys. But you put on a Bigfoot suit and you walk around the woods, you're going to get shot if there's anybody around with a gun. I've decided not to buy a Bigfoot suit and do any funny videos. But this was a great story, great sense of humor this guy has, and I really appreciate him sending the story. Thank you. This gentleman wants to be anonymous, and here's what he writes. This is pretty good. I'm a former active duty Marine Corps sergeant. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Just not in as good a shape as I was then. In the winter of 1997, I was only a Lance Corporal, or an E3, mountain training in Northern California. We'd been training for weeks getting physically acclimated to the mountainous terrain, the higher altitude, and cold weather. But most of us were in good spirits. It was almost over. Our last training evolution was ambush training. We were to set up and wait for the other half of our class. We were to ambush them and they were to defend our foe attack. We were set up in two-man groups, set 20 meters apart just inside a tree line opposite a little valley that acted like a choke point. We all dug in with interlocking fields of fire and distances mapped out. Man, we were ready. The hardest part of the exercise is always to hurry up and wait. It allows for too much speculation. When are they coming? Did they discover us and decide to flank us? Or are they just going to try and sneak past? The mind wanders when you know it's just training. And soon we took turns in our 2-man fighting positions of 1 hour on and 1 hour off watches so we could get some rest, since we had been up for a long time at that point. This game took place from 2100 to 0300. That's 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. for any civilian timekeepers who might be wondering. At 0 hours, several of us heard a loud snap coming from about 100 yards in front of us across the ravine. It sounded like a tree had been quickly and efficiently snapped in two. I rustled my fellow Marines awake. The time to hurry up and wait was past, and we could get this evolution over. Soon we would be all warm and dry and sleeping comfortably. Let's get this done. With our M16A2 rifles fitted with BFAs, blank firing apertures, and mags loaded with blanks at the ready, we waited silently to lay fake waste to the fake enemy. We didn't have fancy night vision goggles and optics back then, so we were operating by the nicely lit star-filled sky. We heard another snap and made ready. Next we heard something crunching through the snowpack across the valley. We were getting itchy on the trigger to get this over with, as we had all waited and focused on the silence. We were trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from, but we still had no visual on the enemy. As we watched for signs of movement, a loud, deep, angry-sounding roar erupted from the far side of the little valley. It occurred to several of us that this might not be the enemy that we were expecting. It was like no other animal we'd ever heard. It had such a deep bass that we could literally feel the sound resonate through our bodies. It must have seen or smelled us. My fellow Marine and I looked at each other with "what the hell was that" written all over our faces. Our radio came alive, telling us to regroup and pack it in. We were confused because we thought that we were finally going to get into the action. But we quickly and quietly moved out and back to the training class site. The next day we did a patrol and assessed the area. The opposite side of the little valley was steep and shaded out by trees, which is why we heard the noise, but couldn't see anything. We soon found huge footprints in the hard-packed snow. I'm 6'3" and I weigh 190 pounds. I could barely crunch down into the snow more than a couple of inches. These tracks were easily packed down 8 inches deep or more. I estimated them to be 16 to 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. As we stared at the prints, our normal banter stopped and we fell silent. We were stunned, not just by the size of the prints, but the distance between them. Whatever this thing was, it had a stride of 6 to 7 feet. The tracks led into the tree line where we could no longer see them. We asked the trainer if we could follow the trail, but tracking something not on the training schedule was not permitted, no matter how much we begged to do it. As the class wrapped up, some of the rowdier, less tactful Marines were already mouthing off about it being a Bigfoot. Well, that was my thought too. We were all told that we didn't see anything, nor did we hear what we thought we heard. That seemed odd, but I didn't question it. I just followed orders. However, as military guys will do, we all discussed it among ourselves and came to the consensus that we all heard and saw the tracks of a Bigfoot. Even though we didn't actually see it, the guttural roar and the tracks convinced us that's what it had to be. I was honestly never scared, nor were any of my fellow Marines. Mostly we were just curious and amazed. I'm guessing the overwhelming fear that people experience is from actually seeing it and not from distant noises. To this day, I fully believe that the source of those sounds and prints was the ever-elusive Sasquatch. I have also come to the conclusion that our training was stopped because our training staff heard it from their position. Maybe they knew something that we didn't. Maybe they were used to being around and knew better than to mess with it. Stay vigilant and Semper Fi. Oh man, that's a great story. He's in Northern California, doing mountain training. My son was stationed in Southern California, and I think all he did was desert training. They did some mountain training in South Korea at one point, jungle training in, where was he? The Philippines, I think. And, but I don't think he ever went to Northern California. And I don't know if there's any Bigfoots in Southern California. But Northern California, yeah, there's all kind of reports of Bigfoot down there, and they're big ones. They're supposedly reported to be big ones. And why would they not creep in on a Marine unit out doing training in Northern California? Makes perfect sense. Too bad you guys weren't armed with live rounds in case that thing came at you. You could have been heroes. You could have had the first body of a Bigfoot. But to the anonymous writer, this was a great story. I love these military stories. They're awesome. I really appreciate you. Thank you. Here's one of these old news articles that I do every once in a while. This was sent to me by Mr. Roper a couple of months ago. Thank you, Mr. Roper, for sending this. I really appreciate it. The article is from the Highland Weekly News of Hillsboro, Ohio. The date of the article is Wednesday, April 11, 1883, and the article appeared on page 6. The title of the article is The Kentucky Wild Man. Among the passengers the other night bound for New York from the west on the day express was a wild man who occupied a seat in smoking car number 153. He was accompanied by James Harvey and Raymond Boyd, his captors, both of whom belong in Paducah, Kentucky. They had 3 second-class tickets to New York, which privileged them to 3 seats in the smoking car of any first-class train. When the day express arrived at the Broad Street station at 8 o'clock, James Harvey ran down the platform into the restaurant and purchased a box of sardines and some sandwiches for the wild man's supper. His companion remained in the smoker in charge of the wild man. He, the wild man, was dressed in citizen's dress and wore big cloth shoes. His hair reaches nearly to his waist and falls over his shoulders, completely covering his back. His beard is long and thick, while his eyebrows are much heavier than those of an ordinary human being. There is nothing imbecilic in the wild man's manners or actions. He cannot talk and seldom makes any sound whatever except a low growl like a leopard. His actions are as much like those of the hyena of the zoological garden. Raymond Boyd, who seemed to have perfect control over the wild man, said his body is covered with coarse brown hair as thick as the hair on a horse's hide. The palms of his hands looked like paws of a bear, and his fingernails, which were over an inch long, resembled the claws of an eagle. He was first seen in Paducah County 13 years ago and was known as Mum the Hermit, because whenever anyone accosted him, all he would say was, "Mum's the word." He lived in an old pine hut in the woods for about 5 years and was seldom seen by anyone. Finally, he abandoned the hut and took up his abode in a cave under a ledge of rocks known as Lizard Rock. A little over 6 years ago, 2 or 3 citizens of Paducah County, while out hunting, saw him running into his cave without a stitch of clothing on him. 3 years ago, it was discovered that a thick coat of hair had grown all over his body. Boyd and Harvey built a man trap for him, and it took over 3 days before he entered it. He was not afraid of any bird or beast of prey, but ran terrified away from any human being who approached him. It took 2 days to accustom the man-beast to their presence. The tinkle of a small dinner bell they used had great influence over him. He watched the bell intently but would not touch it. Some time ago, a farmer missed a calf and 2 sheep which had strayed off. They were tracked to Mum's cave. Here, all trace of them was lost, and it was supposed that he devoured them. In his cave, which he had occupied for the last 7 or 8 years, Boyd and Harvey found the skeletons of small animals and the skins of over 50 snakes. Some of the skins belonged to the most venomous species of reptiles. The floor of the cave was alive with red and green lizards, and hundreds of toads hopped about. The wild man ate the box of sardines voraciously, and the 2 sandwiches which were handed him were greedily pulled apart. He ate the ham and threw the bread away. Whenever a train passed on the opposite track, he crouched down in the corner of the seat, terror-stricken. After the train passed, he would put his hand to his ear and listen with a look of animal cunning stealing out of his restless eyes, like a panther about to pounce on its prey. Every time the engineer blew the whistle, the wild man would grab the back of the seat in front of him with both hands and hold on until the whistle ceased blowing. Boyd had a little tin music box which he manipulated with a crank. The tune that it played was "Empty is the Cradle," and it was ground again and again to the great satisfaction of the ex-hermit, who sat and looked at it silently but would not touch it. When conductor Harry Smith took out his glistening nickel-plated punch to cancel the tickets, the wild man watched the punch intently until he heard it snap. Then he got down in the corner of the car and sat fairly shivering with fear and set up a low howl, supposing evidently that Conductor Smith was about to wing him. Boyd and Harvey said that there was a story to the effect that the wild man had originally come from North Carolina, and that during the war he had been a sharpshooter on Bald Mountain, and that shortly after the war he had murdered a whole family of settlers in the mountain and left. Both Boyd and Harvey appear like shrewd fellows, and they expect to make a fortune out of their prize. Their great anxiety and fear is that the authorities will interfere with them and claim that the man is simply a lunatic and place him in some institution. They had the snake skins in a box in a baggage car, together with some other curiosities found in the cave. Boyd said that the wild man will not touch anything but fruit and meat, which he eats ravenously, and much the same as wild beasts. Cigar smoke bothered him a good deal, and he kept driving it away from him with his clawed hands. When the train arrived in Jersey City, the men took a carriage and said they were going to take the New Haven night boat from the foot of Peak Slip and avoid a daylight crowd in New York. And that's the end of the article. I don't know what to make of that, but it's real interesting. I don't know how much back in 1883 was tabloid-type journalism. I'm sure if I did a little bit of studying, I could find out. But this sounds a little like a tabloid-type thing, like the National Enquirer. But at any rate, it's real interesting, and it could very possibly be true. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Here's a short story from Chris. This is anecdotal stuff, but it's it's interesting to me when I get these because they make a lot of sense to me. Anyway, let me just read the story and you'll see why. She writes, "My story begins in 1982 or somewhere close to that year. My husband and I lived in the middle of 1,700 acres in northwestern Sonoma County, California. We managed a horse boarding operation with 100 head of horses and a few head of cattle. The driveway was about 1.5 miles long from the pavement to the gate of the ranch. There were locks on all outer gates and some inner gates as well. One night I had gone into town for something and I arrived back at the main gate. I got out of the truck to unlock and open the gate. I drove through and then exited the truck to close the gate and relock it. As I approached the gate to close it, I heard the most god-awful scream I've ever heard. It sounded like a woman being terrorized by something. You have to remember, this is out in the middle of nowhere. It was also really dark out, and the only lights were from my truck. I thought about this event for a long time, looking for an answer as to what that scream was made by. I had no clue, but the hair on the back of my neck stood at attention, and I ran closing and locking the gate, and I sprinted to the open door of the truck and hightailed it out of there. I continued to think about that sound, and I could not find an answer. I knew just about every sound by critters in the area, but this one stumped me for sure. In 2016, my oldest son and I were in an apartment living room watching shows that were all about Bigfoot. I was at my desk multitasking when I heard a scream from the television. The hair on the back of my neck stood up all over again, and major goosebumps popped up all over my body. There was a soundtrack playing on the program of Bigfoot sounds, and what gave me this reaction was exactly what I heard 34 years ago. There was absolutely no doubt about it. It had to have been Bigfoot on the hill above the gate. I was totally amazed to learn of this, and oh yes, I do believe in Bigfoot. Chris, that's a great story, and we get these all the time. People hear things way back before Bigfoot, was in vogue, and there was a lot of information out there, and they put two and two together, and the evidence just comes forward. I'm so glad you sent this to me because it's really, really interesting. So thanks, Chris. Hope you guys are doing good out there in California. This next email is from Bethany, and she says, "My name is Bethany. I hope it's okay to email this to you. I'm nervous to share these stories, but you seem to be the right person to tell without judgment and with heart and enthusiasm. I have no fear of Bigfoot, but I do have a healthy respect for them. This is a two-part story, one a couple of years after the other. When I was 8 years old, I lived in Lake Cushman, Washington, in the Olympic Forest land. At this time, I was surrounded by drug addicts, including my parents. My father left my mother, and that set off a bad series of events. The day after he left, my mother and my oldest sister were fighting. They were physically hitting. I got scared and I ran away. I ran into the forest, which has always been my safe place. I normally stayed close to the road or a trail, but this day I ran as far and as fast as I could, and after running for 10 minutes, I realized I was lost, but I kept on walking. I eventually reached a creek and I sat down to rest. It was starting to get dark and I was finally coming to my senses, and I was starting to feel afraid. Suddenly I felt like I was being watched. I could hear something moving slowly, almost gently through the woods. And then the smell hit me. It was almost like a skunk, which is what I thought it was at first. The smell kept getting stronger and the sounds got closer. I didn't see it at first. I just saw big brown eyes way high up in the trees. Gradually, his shape became solid as he continued to move closer to me. He was covered in thick brown hair, and I say it was a he, but I was unsure. I stood up when he got about 3 yards away from me, and he grunted and gestured to the right. I started walking backwards and to the left, and as he was on my right and the creek was directly behind me, he grunted again and he gestured more vigorously. I started crying and walking faster when I heard movement behind me. There was another creature right there. This one seemed heavier but slightly shorter, and it was more feminine, so I will call it a her. She slowly took a step towards me and softly grunted and seemed to stoop as if not to be intimidating. I don't know if I was just giving them human attributes or if they are really that intelligent. They knew I was scared, of that I am sure. I started crying even harder when I felt something small softly hit my back. The male creature, who I had forgotten about, had thrown a pebble at me. He repeated his grunt and his gesture. I was starting to understand, at least I hoped I could, and he was telling me to go. I wanted to run, but I was too scared to move. This is when the most extraordinary thing happened. I felt something soft and warm softly touch my back. With a light pressure, the second creature was pushing me along. That was too much for me, and I ran faster, and the creatures followed behind, one to the left and one to the right, and they stayed back a ways. When I would start to run the wrong direction, one would run faster and grunt and get me back on track. I was shocked when I reached the road. I turned and I saw the female watching me from the forest. I walked to my cousin's house, and that's where I stayed the night. But while I was running, I felt the creature's eyes on me the whole way to the house. I wished I could thank them for guiding me out of the forest. Later on, when I was 11 years old, I was riding bicycles with my best friend. I've always been faster than her, and I was glad of it that day. We were riding not quite 2 miles from where I had my first encounter. I was turning a sharp corner, and I froze. There was a huckleberry bush where we would always stop and pick berries. Standing with its back to me was a large brown creature which I mistook for a bear. I threw my arm out to stop her, and she stopped and let out a blood-curdling scream. The creature turned, and I saw its eyes. I knew those eyes, and I felt joy fill me to see them again. My friend turned and rode away as fast as she could, leaving me alone with the female creature, the same creature who had softly pushed me in the right direction 2 years ago. At that age, I now understood that they had no intention of hurting me. We stood and we stared at each other for a few minutes when I heard a familiar grunt, and there he was standing just inside the tree line. I said hello and that I hoped they were doing well. And then I said thank you for saving me. I'm sure they remembered me. The female moved, and I turned back to her. Without breaking eye contact, she set down a small pile of huckleberries on an old log. She turned and walked back into the woods to her male, and they walked away. And the berries, they were delicious. Oh, Bethany, that's awesome. I don't know what to make out of some of these stories that we get where the Bigfoot is real violent or charges or, does things that scare people or even hurt people. And then we get stories like this where they're just as kind and as respectful as they can be. And this is unreal. I was wondering if you ever talked about it to your friend who was on that bike ride with you, if she's ever talked about it since. But that's a wonderful story, and at a horrible time in your life that was probably terribly confusing to you, here these two creatures emerge in the woods, and they show you some kindness. And, that means a lot during those times, more so than when you don't need it. I just thought this was great, and it was written really well, and Bethany, you did a great job, and thank you for sending this story. It was wonderful. Here's a story from Rick. Here's what he writes. While I was in elementary school in 1971, I saw The Legend of Boggy Creek, and I later read Peter Burns' little paperback book on Bigfoot. The North Georgia mountains, especially the Appalachians, are rich with legends and strange stories about boogers. Parents and adults would say, "Don't go out at night, that's where the booger bears come out," or "Don't go there, the boogers will get you." The problem was that nobody would ever tell you what a booger was or how it looked, so we thought it was only a scary story. In the spring of 1973, a game warden went missing overnight and was found on a rural road walking the next morning by a passing car. He was exhausted and confused with his clothes torn, and he couldn't remember what had happened. It was later said that he claimed to have seen a tall, hairy creature with a big head and a face like a bull. This story was buzzing around for about 2 weeks, and suddenly all talk of it went quiet. We think he either quit or the state relocated him. In March of 1974, I was 15 years old. I didn't drink or smoke or anything like that. I was a straight arrow football player and not the type to tell stories. About 8:30 p.m. I was riding in a car with 3 other guys, and the driver was about 2 years older than us. We were spotlighting deer, illegally, but not for the purpose of shooting one. We were just checking them out. We were going down the main road, and it was barely paved, and it was full of potholes. As we rolled along about 10 to 15 miles an hour, we spotted a buck and 2 does up on a chest-high red clay bank with bushes and overgrowth partially blocking our view. This was at a 4-way crossroads where the very narrow dirt right-hand road led off into a completely deserted forest with no houses. On the left was another dirt gravel road with an old church on the corner. Further down that road were a couple of farms. A river runs down one side that is fed by the Amicalola Falls, which is located at the head of the Appalachian Trail. Ironically, there is an area of the river known as the Devil's Elbow where moonshiners, car thieves, pot growers, and hunters were alleged to have gone missing over the years. This is the same area where the game warden went missing in 1973. I was a passenger in the rear seat and I couldn't really see the deer. We stopped and the guy in front of me got out with a spotlight. It was an old diesel and he shined the deer. Apparently the deer had been running and were tired because they didn't haul butt when we lit them up. About 3 or 4 seconds after exiting the back seat, I heard a crack or a pop 45 degrees to my right in the forest. My friend who was sitting next to me heard it and said, "Oh man, I bet that's the game warden." I said, "That's one noisy game warden." He then began urging the driver to get us out of there. About that time came some more noises, like something large moving through the woods. I instantly thought it was a bear because a 500-pounder was killed in our area, but bears are known to be very quiet when walking. So I started saying, "Let's go," and the hairs started standing up on my arms and neck, and I began to feel sick with fear. About that time, about 75 or 80 feet to my right, at a 15 to 20 degree angle, I watched a huge, hulking figure cross that road from bank to bank in 3 forward-leaning large steps while swinging its arms. From the sound it was making, it appeared to be approaching the deer, and at the moment, they bolted out of there. Now let's pause for a moment as I'm frozen with fear and it seems like time has slowed down. My friend to the left says, "What the hell was that?" And now we're both saying, let's go, and have one foot in the car. And then as I look up on the top of the embankment, I see the outline of a figure move slowly to get behind a tree where its face was obscured. My friend with a spotlight starts slowly getting in the car while me and the other dude dive in the back seat. At this time, my older and more stubborn friend pulls out a .22 pistol and says, "Who are you? Talk to me or I'm going to shoot." Now we're screaming, "Let's go," as he again says, "Tell me who you are or I'm going to shoot." I think my friend in front of me still has the light pointed at it over the door, even though he is now back in the car. At that instant, we hear a bang, bang, as the driver shoots up in the air. He immediately throws the pistol down and jumps in the car as we spin out of there sideways. Now I'm shaking all over so bad that my feet are actually tapping and everybody but the driver is talking at once. I don't remember who asked first. I think the guy in front, but he said, "What did you see?" The driver is silent as we drove until we found a closed gas station and we pulled over. He got out and went to the drink machine and downed a Coke, but he still wouldn't talk. Now my friend is driving us all home and it's about 10 p.m. and we're planning to go back the next day to look around in the daylight. We also agreed to tell our families minus the part about the gunfire, of course. After we drop off my friend in the back, we're headed to my house. My friend in front says to the driver, "Hey man, what did you see?" Nothing but silence until we got to my house where my friend in the front says, "You saw its face, didn't you?" He very quietly said, I sat there for a minute waiting for more, but it was obvious he wasn't talking and it was getting late on that school night. I then had to get out and walk up the long path to the dark backside of the house, which sat at the foot of the mountain. When I got inside, my mom noticed that there was something wrong, and her first question was, "Has somebody been drinking?" Now that was all I needed, so as I finally managed to tell my story, my mom replied, "It's probably the devil." But my dad, who grew up on a farm only a few miles from this incident, sat silent looking at the TV. It was his older generation on both sides of the family who used the term booger. Growing up on a farm, he knew all too well about booger stories and later said that he used to hear the strange screaming sounds in the woods. They always blamed it on the panthers, but they were all hunted and killed by the 1900s. The few other people that I shared this story with laughed and ridiculed me, so I shut my mouth until 1980. The following day, we all headed back, and our driver still wasn't going to talk. We got to the location and we couldn't find footprints, but we did find broken branches and impressions in the ground. Then we got to the tree where its face was hidden. A prominent crooked limb stuck out and bent upward. I could stand flat-footed and reach the limb with my arm almost extended, and that put the creature at about 7 foot 10 inches or possibly more. We went back 2 times at night to look, stupid and heavily armed, but found nothing, thank God. About 2 months later, I was in church and I saw a girl that lived on that same road, but closer to the main highway. I told her what had happened, and a very serious expression overtook her face. She informed me that it had run across the road in front of her one night while coming home from a football game. She also said that her uncle saw it coming out of his chicken house about a year ago. I sat there silently thinking, oh God, why have you allowed such things to exist? In 1980, a new subdivision was being built near our encounter. A story started circulating that the first resident of this subdivision came home one night to find his back door broken down and his kitchen ransacked. Nothing was stolen. Everything was just destroyed. I didn't know the man, but of all things he was related to my friend who drove the night of our encounter. Before church one morning, I again asked some 6 years later if he had seen its face that night, and he nodded yes, and then he looked away. My opinion is that the sight of it really scrambled his eggs and he didn't want to deal with it. As far as I know, nothing ever came of the vandalized house incident, as that story died quickly, just like the game warden story. For some reason, I told my dad a story that a very peculiar aunt told me at the age of 5 or 6. She and my uncle lived in a house on top of a big hill at the foot of a mountain about 7 miles from this incident. She claimed that while rocking on her front porch one night, a large, hairy man with a very ugly face came around the corner and stood motionless looking at her about 8 feet away. She said that she felt paralyzed with fear and could only cut her eyes to look at it. She was unable to call out to my uncle sitting in the living room behind only a foot away. She claimed that she closed her eyes very tight and began praying, and in a few seconds she opened her eyes and the creature was gone. I remember her saying his face looked like it was hit by a hammer. I asked my dad if she was crazy, to which he replied, "Folks thought so." Well, being able to share this is therapeutic. Thankfully, we now have a Bigfoot museum about an hour north of me. I correspond regularly with the owner and the staff, and they say every week at least one person comes in to share a story. I was honored to have met both Scott Carpenter and David Pilatus there. I hope my story wasn't too boring. I just wonder how many people from my area have even better stories to tell, but they fear the ridicule. And he signs it off, Rick. Oh, that's a great story. I love that. North Georgia. I can't remember the name of the falls there at the start of the Amalachicola or something like that. I've never been able to say that word. But that's it's a heavily mountain wooded area. Perfect habitat for Bigfoot. Rick, thanks for that. Thanks for that email. This is awesome. I really appreciate you. Here's a story from Kentucky. This is really good. The man wants to stay anonymous, and here's what he writes. I was born in southern Ohio in the mid-1950s, and my parents moved to northern Indiana before I quit wearing diapers. But my dad was from central Kentucky, just north of the Daniel Boone National Forest. When I was 9 years old, my dad was injured on his job, and for reasons that I'm still not clear about, he went to his parents' house in Kentucky where he would soon die. He took 5 of us kids with him, and my baby sister and my mother would follow very soon. My grandparents' home was out in the sticks, and many sounds could be heard there while sitting on the porch in the evenings. We often heard what was described as wildcats, bobcats screaming just like the sound of a woman, but several times we would hear unusual sounds from the mountains surrounding their home. These were just described as boogers by my uncles who lived with my grandparents. When we heard these screams or sounds, it meant it was time to go inside the house and stay there. If a privy trip was needed out back, it was done by several at a time, but it was done really quickly. A few times they would speak with quiet reverence about boogers and how they had and still at times would enter the home and eat whatever the leftovers were in the bean pot or the slop bucket for the hogs the next day. I once heard them say that you could hear a booger scraping the bottom of a bucket with a spoon or its nails. We were told to lay still and keep quiet if we heard anything entering the house late at night. And on a couple of nights, I could hear the adults talking in whispers about seeing something outside near the window. One night, as my brother and I were laying on a couch in a sitting room just off the kitchen, I heard a noise at the kitchen door, and my brother said he saw something looking in the window. I could not see the window, but I heard whatever it was slam the door open, and we could hear the heavy breathing and the smell. Oh, what a terrible smell, like all the privy had just been brought in with this thing. We heard what was later discovered as a slop bucket being scraped, slurped, and even thrown firmly against a cast iron wood stove and then settle on the floor. After a little snooping around the kitchen, we finally heard this thing leave, and most of the smell went with it. Soon after, my grandmother came out of her and Grandpa's curtain-covered bedroom doorway, and she gently closed the kitchen door. Nothing was ever said, but I could hear her praying under her breath. The next morning, I got up early and went out to the privy, passing a small shed where the big black Angus bull spent his nights. I noticed the bull was lying down, and he wasn't breathing. I ran back to tell Grandpa, and when he finally believed me, he came out and discovered the big bull's neck had been broken by being twisted 360 degrees, which was a devastating blow to my grandfather, as his bull supplied an extra income in breeding fees. Grandpa and my uncles had to quarter the bull just to get it loaded for burying. My father died a few days later at almost 40 years of age, and we left soon after, heading back to Indiana and away from what was a strange world to us kids. Later in life, in the mid-90s, I went to Kentucky to go deer hunting with my cousin on some property adjacent to the Daniel Boone National Forest. We scouted out a good ridge that even had a couple of caves to access in bad weather. I chose to hunt in a creek bottom while my cousin hunted the ridge, and just as day was breaking, I heard a noise that sounded like something crashing down from the ridge in my direction. I mean, trees being broken repeatedly, and like a dozer without an engine was putting in a new road. When whatever it was got to the bottom near a trail, it stopped and gave a loud growl that nearly made me wet my pants. At the same time, this thing stopped about 40 or 50 yards away, and several deer were trying to step gingerly over my head while I remained in position on a tree root in a creek bank. After maybe 15 seconds, and it felt like 20 minutes, I could clearly smell the stench of this beast. And my mind went back to the mid-60s and what had happened at my grandparents' house, which was only about 20 minutes away by the curvy country road. Then the beast chose a path leading away from me in a different direction from the deer that it was possibly chasing, but between my cousin and myself. I waited about 20 minutes and left to find my cousin, and I found him examining a newly built path coming down the mountain. I asked if he heard all the commotion, and he simply replied, "It's time for us to leave now," and we spoke nothing about that hunt to each other or anyone else since. Perhaps not as much concerned with anyone not believing us as to worry about having the beast return to us in greater anger later. Man, what a story. I mean, he has an experience when he's a kid at his grandparents' house, and then many years later, 40 years later, he's back in the same area and a Bigfoot walks right over him? Did I read that right? The Bigfoot stepped over his head and kept following some deer? That is insane. What an encounter. Thank you, sir, for sending this. It was a great and exciting story. I appreciate it. This is an email from Carrie. I've had this for a long time, actually over a year, and I'm just now getting to it, and it's pretty good. Hope you guys enjoy it. I've always been interested in Bigfoot. I was wondering which came first, my encounter or the Patterson-Gimlin film. Well, a quick internet search said the Patterson film was first released in October of 1967. My encounter happened sometime in 1965 before I started first grade. I was 5 years old. Now I'm 59 years old. So I didn't have the Patterson-Gimlin film to influence me. This is a true story, and I will never forget that night. My dad was in the Air Force and stationed at Patrick Air Force Base in Melbourne, Florida, just southeast of Orlando. I know, it's not the mecca of Bigfoot sightings. We lived in a ranch-style house in a neighborhood where all the streets were named after cars. We lived at the end of Buick Avenue. I always felt like such a grown-up walking miles to school with my brother, but looking at it from Google Earth now, I see it was only 0.8 miles. But there were kids everywhere walking to school. In those days, we always played outside, riding bikes, catching frogs, and trying to outdo my older brother in everything. My brother and I shared a bedroom on the backside of our house. One night, we heard something, and we both jumped out of our beds and we looked out our window. It was pitch black, and we were supposed to have been asleep. The moon was shining, and we both saw the silhouette of something walking in the ditch coming from the area where all the bulldozing had been going on. They were building new subdivisions behind us. We knew how deep the ditch was, and whatever this was, the head and shoulders were sticking above the rim. My brother said, "It's a giant," and I said, "No, it's a monster." And then we both looked at each other and said, "It's a giant monster." We wanted to tell our mom and dad, but we knew they wouldn't believe us, and we would get in trouble for not being asleep. I got a spanking most every day for something or another, and I didn't want another one. We just stood there peering out our ground-level window, watching this thing until it walked out of sight. After it was gone, we made sure our window was locked, and we pulled a curtain closed tight. We laid in our twin beds with the sheets and blankets pulled up to our noses, and we whispered about what we had just seen. And then we thought, maybe it wasn't a giant monster, maybe it was a person. But who would be walking down the side of the ditch in the middle of the night without a flashlight? Well, we finally went to sleep. The next morning came, and we were both normally hard to get out of bed when Mom told us to get up. But on this day, we both woke up on the first call, and we ran down the hall and out the back door, still in our pajamas. We raced across the backyard and looked inside the ditch. The only tracks we saw were our own from days before. The ditch was full of water, and we decided this monster was walking in the water and he wouldn't have left tracks. We flew back to the house telling everyone what we had seen the night before. Mom and Dad laughed and said it was our imaginations. Our little sister, who was only 3.5, began to cry because we said the word monster and that it had been in the backyard. Of course, we got in trouble for that, too. And since we didn't have any proof for anyone to see and trying to keep from getting a spanking for making our sister cry, or for telling a lie, or both, we never mentioned it again. A few months later, a company was going house to house to see if anyone wanted to have a ditch or their creek piped in and covered over, and Mom and Dad agreed to have that done. Both of our neighbors had also had it done on both sides. So they came and put in big concrete pipes and covered it with dirt and sod. Mom and Dad now claimed this extra space as our yard, and they planted Spanish bayonets all along the border. These plants, like the name implied, would stick you like a knife if you bumped into them. My brother and I always kept an eye out for the giant monster, but we never saw it again. We knew the bulldozers had bulldozed its home, and we wondered where it had moved to. But we always made sure our window was locked and the curtains pulled close tight at night, just in case. Being in the Air Force, Dad got transferred every 2 years, so we moved away to his next base. Years later, I got married, had a son, and eventually got divorced. Later, I was buying a home that backed up to some woods. My son was 4 at the time. I found a split foyer house and I bought it. Of course, I claimed the master bedroom on the front of the house for myself, and I told my son that he could choose between the remaining 2 bedrooms on the rear of the house for his bedroom. He looked at both bedrooms carefully and he looked out each window. He stood there thinking about it, and he chose the corner bedroom on the right. Just out of curiosity's sake, I asked him why he chose that room. He said that it was higher off the ground and that wolves couldn't jump up that high. I didn't tell him there were no wolves in our state. I just smiled at him, and thinking back on my low Florida window and the giant monster when I was about his age, I said, "Son, that's a good choice." And then Carrie signs off. I don't know. I guess if I was a kid looking out the back with my brother, someone there to confirm it, and I saw this big hulking creature moving through the ditch in my backyard, I doubt I would ever forget that too. But you never saw it again. Florida is actually rich in Bigfoot encounters. I think they call it the skunk ape. So there's a wealth of encounters down there, especially in those Everglade areas and that real low area. So this makes perfect sense. Buddy, it's a good story. I sure appreciate you. You did a great job writing it.
Moss by Austin Mooney. Sunlight soaked through the fabric of its clear liquid body, and the moss ball suspended within it glowed a fantastic hue of lime green that Luke had never seen. He received a mysterious package in the mail this morning which contained the clear container filled with water and carrying a soft moss ball about the size of a nickel. There was no return address to be found on the package. It was wrapped in brown paper with a neat tweed string knot on top. The only information that accompanied it was a small card describing the moss. Screaming moss, it read, found in the depths of Iceland's most remote lakes. Screaming moss is named for its loud lime green hue and the screaming sound it produces when it dries out. Keep in fresh water and clean container daily. Luke assumed it must have been a gift from one of his friends. He had gone to the Saturday market with a modest group of them the previous weekend. Local artists, food vendors, and gardeners and craftsmen from the surrounding area come together in a small clearing by Lake Donovan every Saturday to sell their wares. It has primarily become a place for locals to take visiting family from out of town to give them a taste of the city, but some discoveries surprise even the oldest frequenters. On this particular afternoon, Luke saw a new booth selling moss balls. His friends were surprised when he earnestly commented that he would like to purchase a moss ball. They scrunched their faces and looked at him confused. They asked him why he would want something so useless. "It's not useless," he replied. "It's like a pet." The group's movement kept him from further exploring the booth than a passing glance and a light remark. The man maintaining the temporary storefront was mostly hidden, sitting behind his neatly uniformed displays. The top of his head was all they could see. Curly gray hair stretched toward the sky, and he appeared to be looking down at his lap, and Luke got the disturbing feeling that he could hear them discussing his passion. They moved away from the booth and joined the wandering crowd, the moss balls quietly dissolving behind them. Luke thought it was lovely of his friends to send him something so thoughtful for no reason other than his expressed interest in it. Of course, he would need to find out who had sent it and return the favor somehow, but for now he needed to find a place to display his newest friend. It deserved prominence in his home. The container made an excellent decoration on his desk, clean, modern, and containing a living organism. It was a perfect new addition to the shrine of personal objects that kept Luke calm during his working hours. It quickly became his most prized possession, and he loved it as though it were a proper pet. However, the day after he received it, he realized how strictly the instructions for cleaning the container were meant to be followed. A black slime waste lined the container in a thin, glossy film. The moss ball was rotting away its already crowded habitat and suffocating itself with its own refuse. Luke gasped upon seeing it and took it to the kitchen. He removed the container's lid and poured the ball into his hand. The fuzz tickled his palm. He placed it on a plate and began scrubbing the container with soap and hot water, assuming the ball would be fine for the moment it took him to complete his chore. He didn't consider putting it into another container of water. He let it sit drying on the plate. What harm could a couple of minutes bring? The moss ball began to change shape. It was vibrating with a lime green color that was becoming more intense, draped in the fading sheen of its drying skin. At first, it appeared to be shriveling, and then the wrinkles found definition. The features of a face, an older man's face, formed across the fuzzy surface of the moss ball as its hot emerald glow became harder and harder to bear with the naked eye. Once the exclamation of its color reached a fever pitch and the face fully formed, its features shook with intent and involuntary spasms. And then the screaming began. A blaring, sharp, agonizing, evil, and terrible distressing expulsion of energy in the form of a scream filled the room and knocked Luke backward. Its mouth appeared to be open, but whether the screaming had waited for that detail to begin wreaking havoc was unclear. Did the moss ball need its mouth to scream? How could it make a sound like this? Luke's mind rattled and raced for a solution to this alarming development. He quickly filled a cup with water and dropped the moss ball inside. The screaming ended as it gently sank to the bottom. The face faded away and the color returned to its typical hue. The wrinkles smoothed out. It was a standard moss ball again. He wasn't worried about his neighbors' reactions to its scream. They wouldn't react even if it was a person. He shuddered to imagine this situation occurring during one of the many days his landowner shut off the water in his apartment complex for one reason or another without warning. After taking a moment to catch his breath and lower his heart rate, Luke telephoned a friend who was with him on that Saturday afternoon at the market. "What's up?" Sarah answered. "Hey," Luke said before taking a moment to touch his ear and lament the damage recently done to his hearing. Did you send me a moss ball in the mail?" "Well, no," Sarah laughed. "Do you want me to?" "I got one yesterday and I don't know where it came from. I didn't order it and there's no return address, but it's addressed to me. So I thought maybe because we saw the moss ball stand at Saturday market and I said I liked moss, you guys sent me a moss ball." "Oh, that would have been nice. I wish I had done that. Sorry," said Sarah. "Well, do you know who sent it?" "Nobody said anything to me about it, but we were with Keith and Jesse the whole day. I don't know how they could have done it without you knowing unless they went to the seller's website or something. Have you asked them?" "Not yet, but I don't feel like they did it either," Luke said. "That would be uncharacteristically thoughtful of them," Sarah said with an audible grin. "It's so weird," said Luke. "Maybe the guy running the stand heard your interest and figured out where you lived and sent it to you," said Sarah. "Why would he do that?" "He sells moss on Saturday market. He's probably weird. I don't know. I'm just trying to come up with ideas." "Will you come with me to the market again tomorrow? I want to see if the vendor is there and I can ask him about it. It's pretty crazy moss. It's from Iceland." "Ooh, that sounds cool. Yeah, I'm free. I can meet you," said Sarah. "How about 10 o'clock? I'll buy coffee." "Perfect," she said. The two friends ended their conversation and Luke called the others. Keith and Jesse had the same response as Sarah. They all said that they would meet him at Saturday market the following day to speak with the moss salesman, and after he got off his final call, Luke dipped the clean container into the cup. He scooped up the moss ball, making sure not to let it leave the water, and returned it to his desk. The next morning, Luke woke to the sound of screaming. Tides of wailing rattled the walls of Luke's apartment as he threw himself out of bed and sprinted to his desk. He had forgotten to secure the lid back over the container, and the water had evaporated overnight. Now the moss ball was fully exposed. In its death throes, it screeched louder than before. Its vibrancy began to fade, and it started shifting from lime green to dark green to brown, and as its color faded, its screaming got louder. Luke picked up the container and ran it over to his kitchen sink. He turned the faucet, but nothing came out. The distinct low fizzle of empty pipes attempting to suck up absent water pierced through the moss ball's cries. The water had been shut off. And then, in the chaos of his mind, Luke acted on the first two impulses that would surprise him that day. He took a knife out of his kitchen drawer and he cut the moss ball in half. Any notion of this thing being his pet was no longer of concern to him. He did not care for it. It was madness to impose such a responsibility onto someone. The two halves formed into two faces. They both screamed. They both got louder. He pulled a box of matches out of the drawer and he lit one and he set them on fire. The screaming stopped. Everything stopped. There was silence. Luke felt the cooled, wet presence of blood flowing down the left and right sides of his neck. His fingers followed the paths up to his ears. His eardrums had burst. He could still feel the screaming, perhaps louder than before, but he could not hear it. The blast of energy from the sound waves rattled through his abdomen, and sensations wrapped into each other and sounds became feelings. He could feel it deep inside, and it made him sick. His stomach turned rotten. Even death he could not escape. The moss balls had burned to black ash, but they were still screaming. The ash was screaming. Luke wiped the ash back into the container and fastened the lid over it to stifle its cry. He put it in his trunk and wiped the blood from his neck and drove to Lake Donovan. It was 9:15, and Saturday market vendors had just finished setting up their stands. The sun was rising over the water and the weather was expected to cooperate. It was, for everyone else, shaping up to be a perfect Saturday. Luke parked and got out of his car with a container. He knew people were wondering about the screaming. He knew they were looking at him carrying his moss ball container full of ash. And for a moment, he was happy he couldn't hear anything. He didn't want to hear anyone try to stop him. He approached the water's edge and looked down. There wasn't a beach to speak of. Luke was standing on an elevated platform 20 feet above the water's surface. The water went down another 40 feet below that. It got deep and dark right from the bank. He took the container out of his pocket and removed the lid before dropping it into the water. And the moment it touched the surface, the pain in his gut went away, and he felt immense relief. Stress from the sonic attack that had been waged against him dissipated. He felt safe now. However, soon that feeling was replaced by another. He felt the ghostly presence of someone behind him. He could tell who it was. It was the same feeling he had last week when he thought the moss seller could hear him. It was him, and he was standing behind Luke. As a hand touched Luke's shoulder, he acted on the second of two impulses that surprised him that day. He pulled the hand forward and he threw the person behind him into the water below. A small, old man's body slapped against the water and slowly sank. His curly hair grasped toward the surface like a crowd of little arms all crawling against the pull of the deep. His face turned toward the surface and Luke could see it, and it was the same face that had formed in the moss. It was his face. The ash of the former moss ball still near the surface clung to his limp body as he sank, and it began to spread out and grow. Dark sludge wrapped around him in a slimy cocoon, and it turned from black to brown to bright green. His body was bringing the moss back to life. The moss was feeding off of his body. It was thriving around him, and before disappearing into the dark, Luke saw the true size of this new moss ball, and the pain returned to his stomach. Another hand touched his shoulder. Luke turned quickly to see Sarah. She was speaking, but he couldn't hear her. His strength gave out, and he abruptly sat on the ground. Sarah asked him a couple of unanswered questions before making him stand up and guiding him to the car. While she drove them to the hospital, he looked out the window, and he watched the lake pass by and wondered if they would pull the old man's body out. Would they know the enormous moss ball was him? He wondered if they would have to drain the lake to find him. What an incredible sound that would be. Woo, that's a long podcast. Thanks for joining me on this. I really appreciate you. If you've listened this far and you're hearing this, and you haven't already, it'd be great if you would hit the subscribe button and come back for the next video. I'd really appreciate it, but only do that if you enjoyed it. And with that said, we'll see you guys on the next podcast. Thank you.